On the 19th of July, 1821, Westminster Abbey played host to the most extravagant coronation in the history of England. It had been staged at ruinous expense to glorify one man. There was cloth of gold and crimson velvet, a train so vast it required a small army of pages to carry it, and a crown blazing with jewels hired for the occasion, because even a king this spendthrift could not afford to buy them. And at the center of it all, lowered with some difficulty onto the throne, sat the reason for the whole colossal pageant, George IV, King of the United Kingdom. Enormous, corseted, rouged and radiant, a 58-year-old monument to appetite, being crowned at last after a lifetime of waiting. And outside, at the great doors of the Abbey, a woman was hammering to be let in. She was Caroline of Brunswick, and she was the king's own wife, the Queen of England, with every legal right to be crowned at his side. She went from entrance to entrance in the summer heat, and at each one soldiers with crossed bayonets turned her away on the king's explicit and personal order. Some in the crowd jeered her, many more pitied her, and there she was left, the Queen of England, locked out of her own coronation, humiliated before the assembled world by a husband who had spent 25 years trying to destroy her, and who would succeed in a way within a month when she was dead. History has filed George IV under comedy. He is Prinny, the fat, foolish Prince Regent of the cartoons, a punchline in a powdered wig. It is a portrait he half-earned, and it is far too kind. Because the joke lets us forget the woman at the door, and the other woman he secretly married and denied, and the friends he betrayed, and the fortune he burned while his country starved and bled. This is the story of the real George IV. We will keep the charm and the taste, which were genuine. And we will show the scandal the caricature turned into farce, and find a man far darker than the joke allows. Everything George IV became, the extravagance, the appetite, the endless rebellion against every rule, can be traced back to the man he spent his whole life trying not to be, his father. George Augustus Frederick was born on the 12th of August 1762 at St. James's Palace, the eldest of what would eventually be 15 children of King George III and his German queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. It should have been the most fortunate of beginnings, heir to the throne of a rising empire, first son of a young and popular king. But the household into which he was born was, by the standards of a royal court, an almost freakishly strict and joyless one, and the man at its head was determined that it should be so. George III was, in his early and sane years, a genuinely admirable king and a deeply limiting father. Unlike the two Georges before him, he was faithful to his wife, frugal with his money, early to bed, suspicious of pleasure, and consumed by a sense of duty so total that it left little room for warmth. He was Farmer George, happiest inspecting turnips and account books, and he intended to raise his sons to be as dutiful, as disciplined, and as morally rigid as himself. The regime he devised for them was harsh, a remote establishment away from the corrupting court, a punishing schedule of lessons, plain food, plain clothes, and the rod. The princes were flogged for their faults, drilled in virtue, and kept, as far as possible, from the temptations of the world. It was, for a boy of the particular temperament of the young Prince of Wales, exactly the wrong upbringing, a pressure cooker with the lid screwed down. For George was not his father. Where the king was plain, the son was brilliant. Where the king was frugal, the son was insatiable. Where the king distrusted pleasure, the son was a natural sensualist who wanted every pleasure the world could offer, all at once, immediately. He was, by every account, an extraordinarily attractive young man, tall, handsome before the fat came, graceful, quick, funny, musical, a gifted mimic, blessed with charm that could light a room and a real discriminating love of beauty in all its forms. He could have been the ornament of any age. He was also from very early vain, weak-willed, self-indulgent, dishonest when it suited him, and utterly without the internal break that his father's whole life had been built to install. The collision was inevitable, and it came early. As the boy grew into a young man under his father's suffocating discipline, he did what such boys so often do. He broke for the exact opposite of everything the regime demanded. If the king prized sobriety, the son would drink. If the king prized chastity, the son would chase every beautiful woman at court. If the king prized economy, the son would spend. By his late teens, the Prince of Wales was already a byword for dissipation, drinking deep, gambling recklessly, and running up debts, and throwing himself into the first of the grand public love affairs that would pattern his whole life. The most notorious of these early passions was for a beautiful and famous actress named Mary Robinson, known to the town as Perdita for the role in which the prince first saw her, a liaison conducted with so little discretion and ended with so little honor that it cost the prince a small fortune in hush money and taught the public very early exactly what kind of air they had been given. To his father watching, this was not youthful high spirits, it was a moral catastrophe, and worse, a personal betrayal. The living repudiation of everything George III had tried to build. The king's disapproval hardened into something like disgust, and the son's resentment hardened to match it. What developed between them was not the ordinary friction of fathers and sons, but a deep, poisonous, lifelong antagonism, fought out over money, over women, over politics, and, beneath all of it, over the throne itself, because the terrible arithmetic of monarchy meant that the son could only truly come into his own when the father was dead or mad, and both of them knew it. The Prince of Wales spent his youth waiting, resentfully and expensively, for a crown he could not have while his father lived, and the king spent his watching his heir become the ruin he had raised him so strictly to avoid. It is worth holding on to this, because it is the key to the whole strange and scandalous life that followed. George IV is easy to despise, and much of what he did earned the despising. But the man was made, in large part, by that early war, by a rigid, cold, and eventually mad father, and by a nature that answered rigidity with appetite and coldness, with a desperate, bottomless need to be adored. It does not excuse what he became, but it explains why a boy of such gifts grew into a man who would marry in secret and lie about it, marry again for money and destroy the bride, betray his friends, bankrupt himself for beauty, and end his days a bloated recluse claiming victories he had never won, and why, at the last, the most powerful newspaper in the world could write that no human being had ever been less mourned. All of that began here, in the joyless nursery of a dutiful king, with a brilliant and hungry boy learning lesson by lesson to want everything his father forbade. In the summer of 1783, the cage that had held the Prince of Wales since childhood finally opened. On the 12th of August, he turned 21, and with his majority came the two things he had wanted above all others: a household of his own and money to run it. He was given Carlton House, a somewhat run-down mansion on the south side of Pall Mall, its gardens opening onto St. James's Park, and Parliament, after an unseemly and very public wrangle over the sum, granted him an income to keep it. It was a great deal of money. It was also, to George's mind, an affront, a fraction of what his allies in the opposition had pressed for on his behalf, and nothing at all beside the scale of the life he intended to lead. He had waited the whole of his short life to be free of his father's supervision, and the first lesson of his freedom was that it would not reach as far as his desires. He set about living all the same, as though it would. What followed was the making of a legend, and, for once, the legend was, in large part, earned. Over the next decade, the Prince of Wales made himself the most fashionable man in Europe, and the phrase that attached itself to him, the first gentleman of Europe, was not yet, in these years, entirely a sneer. He had a real and discriminating gift. In the grey, buttoned, self-consciously plain court of his father, where display was distrusted as a kind of vice, the prince understood that elegance could be a form of argument, and that to dress, to build, and to entertain with brilliance was to make a statement about the sort of man, and the sort of England, he meant to embody. He did not merely spend on beautiful things. He chose them, and chose them well, with an eye that men far soberer than he acknowledged to be genuinely fine. Nowhere was that eye more visible than at Carlton House itself, which the prince set about transforming into the most sophisticated private palace in the kingdom. He engaged the architect Henry Holland and, over years of restless and ruinous revision, turned the tired old mansion into a sequence of rooms of cool neoclassical splendor, a screen and portico to the street, a great columned hall, chambers hung with silk and crowded with the finest French furniture, Sèvres porcelain, bronzes, and pictures. Much of the taste was French, and deliberately so, acquired with real knowledge and a collector's patience. A good part of what he gathered in this manner over his lifetime would one day pass to the nation. This was not the reflexive acquisitiveness of a bored rich boy. It was connoisseurship, and it is one of the few things George did in his life that posterity has had no cause to regret. The tragedy, already legible in the accounts, was that he could not tell the difference between having a great eye and having the means to indulge it without end. His enthusiasms ran well beyond furniture and dress. He was a genuine and knowledgeable lover of music. He played the cello and sang, kept fine musicians about him, and lent his patronage to the concerts and composers of the day at a time when royal encouragement still counted for a great deal. He read widely and with taste, collected books and miniatures and the work of living painters, and took a close, informed interest in architecture that went well beyond an amateur's dabbling. Contemporaries who came to scoff at his extravagance often left impressed, in spite of themselves, by the range and quickness of his mind and the sureness of his eye. Already in these first years of independence, the direction his taste would ultimately take was visible in outline. At Brighton, the small fishing town on the Sussex coast to which he had begun to retreat, he had taken a modest farmhouse and set about enlarging it. And though the fantastical domes and minarets of the Royal Pavilion still lay far in the future, the impulse behind them, the reach for the exotic, the theatrical, the frankly magnificent, was already stirring. Whatever else might be said of him, George was not a passive spender. He was a maker of taste, an active and discriminating force in the visual and musical culture of his country, and in an age less burdened by his failings, he might have been remembered chiefly for it. The tragedy was that the same restless hunger that made him a patron made him also a bottomless drain, and the one could not be had without the other. The prince's cult of style found its purest expression not in himself, but in a younger man who entered his circle a little later, and whose name has outlasted almost everyone else's in this story. George Brian Brummel, Beau Brummel, was a commoner of modest origins and monumental self-possession, who grasped more clearly even than his royal patron that true distinction lay not in ostentation, but in an almost ascetic perfection of the ordinary. Brummel's revolution was one of restraint. Dark, exquisitely cut coats in place of embroidery and color, spotless linen, a cravat starched and folded with a care that could consume a morning, and an insistence on plain cleanliness in an age that thought little of it. For a time the prince and the dandy were intimates, and between them they fixed the code of male elegance that the whole fashionable world hurried to copy. That the friendship would end, years on, in coldness and ruin, Brummel dropped, then bankrupt, then dead in poverty abroad, was a pattern the prince's friends would learn to recognize. For now it was one more ornament of a glittering circle that had formed with startling speed around a young man raised to want none of it. The charm was as real as the taste. Those who met the young prince, even those disposed to disapprove, came away disarmed. He was tall, and before the years of excess thickened him strikingly handsome. He was warm, quick and funny, an accomplished mimic, and a graceful talker who could make a guest feel briefly like the most interesting person in England. He had music and languages, and a memory stocked with poetry and gossip in equal measure. He drew around him the wittiest and most talented men of the age. Fox, Sheridan, the leaders of literary and political London, and he could hold his own among them. It is worth holding on to this, because the caricature that would later bury him leaves it out entirely. For a season, the Prince of Wales was genuinely dazzling, and much of the devotion he inspired was freely and reasonably given. He turned that magnetism, almost at once, to the purpose that gave his early manhood its shape. The wounding of his father. The surest way to injure a Tory king who prized duty, economy, and the settled order was to embrace that king's enemies, and George embraced them with relish. He attached himself to the opposition Whigs and to their leader, Charles James Fox, a man of extraordinary gifts and extraordinary appetites, a spellbinding orator, a compulsive gambler, and a champion of liberty whose private life was as disordered as the prince's own. In Fox, George found a mentor after his own heart and a standing rebuke to everything George III held sacred. He haunted Brooks's club, where Fox reigned, losing fortunes at the tables and talking politics until the dawn. The friendship was genuine on both sides, and it was also, on the prince's part, a weapon. Every hour spent in Fox's company was an hour that told his father he had raised a son who would take the other side. The consequences reached well beyond the dinner table. In the bitter Westminster election of 1784, with Fox fighting for his political survival, the Prince of Wales threw his name and his popularity into the contest on his friend's behalf, lending open support to a campaign whose canvass through the London crowds became one of the spectacles of the age. To a king who believed the heir to the throne owed his ministers loyalty and his father obedience, the sight of that heir electioneering for the leader of the opposition came very near to treason within the family. It was, in miniature, the shape of the reign to come. For as long as George III lived and governed, his son and his son's friends would form a rival court, waiting, not always patiently, for the day the old king should fail and power fall to them. That day would arrive sooner than any of them expected, and it would not bring what they hoped. Beneath the brilliance, meanwhile, the foundations were already giving way. The spending was not merely lavish, it had come loose from any relation to income. Carlton House alone was a wound that would not close, swallowing money in an endless round of building, demolition and rebuilding as the prince's taste refined and changed its mind. The stables, the pictures, the clothes, the entertaining, and above all the gaming drew on a purse that had never been deep enough and was now, within a very few years, empty. By the middle of the decade, the Prince of Wales owed sums that ran into the hundreds of thousands of pounds, a fortune of a scale that could have kept a great estate for generations, and he went on borrowing against a future he did not yet possess on the security of a crown his father showed every sign of wearing for a long time to come. The king watched the mounting bills and the scandalous alliances with a cold and unforgiving eye, and saw not a gentleman of taste, but a wastrel dishonoring the throne. This was the paradox that would define him, and it is worth stating plainly because the comedy of the later years obscures it. The charm and the ruin were the same coin. The very qualities that made George delightful, the impulsiveness, the hunger for beauty and sensation, the incapacity to be told no, were the qualities that were bankrupting him, and would in time do far worse than that. A man who cannot deny himself a picture cannot, in the end, deny himself anything, and the appetite that built the loveliest rooms in London was the same appetite that would soon wreck the lives of the people who came within its reach. He was, at 23, a spectacle of promise and of warning in equal measure. And in the very years his debts were climbing past all hope of easy rescue, he met the person on whom that appetite would fasten most completely of all. Not a princess, not an actress, but a quiet, devout, twice-widowed woman who wanted nothing he was accustomed to giving, and whose refusal would drive him to the most reckless act of his life. Of all the appetites that governed the Prince of Wales, the strongest and the least characteristic was the one that fastened, in the year 1784, upon a woman who wanted nothing he was used to offering. Maria Fitzherbert was 28 years old, 6 years his senior, and already twice a widow. Born Mary Ann Smythe into a family of respectable Catholic gentry, she had buried 2 husbands before she was 30 and come into a comfortable independence, and she carried herself with a settled dignity, grave, warm, devout, entirely self-possessed, that set her apart from the actresses and court beauties who had filled the prince's life so far. She was handsome rather than dazzling, fair-haired, with an air of unforced propriety. And she was, by every barrier the age could raise, impossible, a commoner, a widow, and above all a Roman Catholic, which, in the England of her day, was not a private matter of conscience, but a permanent political disability. To the Prince of Wales, accustomed to being refused nothing, she was the one thing he could not have, and he wanted her with an intensity that quickly curdled from courtship into something like mania. She refused him. She would not become his mistress. Her religion and her self-respect alike forbade it, and unlike so many others she did not bend. Her resistance only inflamed him. He laid siege to her with the whole theatrical armory of his nature, the tears, the letters of feverish length, the vows, the desperation, and when these failed, he reached, it was said, for the ultimate instrument of the melodramatic soul, and threatened his own life. According to the account that came down from Maria's own circle, in the summer of 1784, the prince's attendants brought her word that he had wounded himself and lay dying, and begged her to come to him at once. She went, taking the Duchess of Devonshire with her as chaperone and witness, and at his bedside a ring was pressed upon her finger. Whether the wound was serious or a piece of stagecraft, no one could afterwards be sure. What is certain is that Maria, badly frightened by the whole performance and distrusting both the prince and herself, fled the country as soon as she was free of it, and spent more than a year abroad in an effort to escape him. He pursued her across the continent with a torrent of letters, one of them reportedly running to many dozens of pages. In the end she came home, and in the end she gave way, not to become his mistress, but to become, in the only sense that was open to her, his wife. On the 15th of December, 1785, in the drawing-room of her own house in Park Street, Mayfair, the Prince of Wales married Maria Fitzherbert. a young Anglican clergyman brought out of a debtor's prison and paid for his trouble, performed the rites. Her uncle and her brother stood as witnesses. The words of the marriage service of the Church of England were spoken over them in secret. In her conscience and in the sight of her God, Maria was from that moment a wife, and she held to that conviction to the end of her long life. And by the plain rites of the Church, the ceremony was real. But it is essential to be exact about what had and had not taken place, because the whole tragedy of Maria Fitzherbert lies in the gap between what the marriage was to her and what it was to the law. It was, in law, no marriage at all. Two separate walls of statute stood against it, and either alone was enough to bring it down. The first was the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, passed at George III's own insistence, which declared that no descendant of George II under the age of 25 could marry without the reigning monarch's express consent, and the prince, 23 and estranged from his father, had neither sought that consent nor had the smallest hope of obtaining it. By that act alone the marriage was void from the instant the vows were spoken. The second wall was older and, for the woman involved, crueler still. Under the Act of Settlement, which bound the crown to the Protestant line, any heir who married a Roman Catholic forfeited his place in the succession altogether. Had the marriage somehow been valid, in other words, it would have cost George the throne. He had, with his eyes open, bound himself in conscience to a woman he could never in law acknowledge, and whose acknowledgement would have unmade him as king. It was a private truth and a public impossibility, held together only by silence. It is hard at this distance to feel how dangerous that secret truly was. Anti-Catholic feeling in the England of the 1780s was not a genteel prejudice but a live and violent force. Only 5 years before the marriage, in the summer of 1780, London had been given over for the better part of a week to the Gordon riots, anti-Catholic mobs burning chapels and houses and prisons, the worst civil disorder the capital had known. The whole constitutional settlement of the previous century, the Revolution of 1688 and the Act of Settlement that followed it, had been erected for the single purpose of keeping the Crown Protestant and Catholics far from it. For the heir to that throne to have married a Roman Catholic in secret was therefore no private indiscretion, but a charge laid against the foundations of the state. The kind of thing that, once believed, could have shaken the monarchy itself. This was why the rumor could not simply be left to fade, and why, when it threatened his money, it had to be not softened, but flatly and publicly denied. For a woman like Maria, devout and self-respecting, there was a bitter irony in the whole business. She had refused to compromise her faith by becoming the prince's mistress, and had consented to marry him precisely so that her conscience might be clear, and it was that same faith and that same marriage that George would now require the world to be told had never existed. The thing she had done to keep her honor was the thing he could least afford to let her be known to have done. For a few years the silence held, and they were, by the standards of George's life, happy. He was by several accounts a tender and attentive companion in this period, steadied by an attachment that offered him the nearest thing to peace he would ever know, and Maria, discreet and dignified, asked for nothing but the constancy he had sworn. But a secret of this kind could not be sealed off from the rest of his life, and the rest of his life was collapsing under the weight of his debts. By 1787 the prince's finances had reached a crisis that only Parliament could relieve, and Parliament would not vote a shilling to a prince suspected of having secretly and illegally married a Catholic. The rumor of the marriage, vague, persistent, and entirely true, had become the single greatest obstacle between George and the money he needed. And so, to clear the obstacle, the truth was denied. The denial was not spoken by the prince himself, but by the friend he had made the keeper of his conscience. In April of 1787, on the floor of the House of Commons, with the question of the prince's debts before the House, and a member pointedly raising the marriage rumor as a matter touching both church and state, Charles James Fox rose and declared the story a gross and malicious falsehood, a calumny, he said, fit only for the lowest and most vulgar minds, without a particle of foundation in fact. He spoke, so far as can be told, in good faith. The prince had assured him personally that there was nothing in it, and Fox denied on his friend's word what his friend had privately sworn was untrue. The lie was therefore double-edged, and it cut two people at once. It cut Maria, who learned that the man she had risked everything for had allowed her marriage to be dismissed before Parliament and the nation as a vulgar fiction, and herself, by plain implication, branded as a kept woman, a mistress who had let herself be taken without the sanction of a ring. She was said to have remarked bitterly that Fox had rolled her in the gutter, and it cut Fox, who discovered only afterwards that he had stood up in the highest forum in the land and staked his honor on a falsehood, and who never fully forgave the prince for it. A softer statement was later got up, through the intervention of another of the prince's friends, to salve Maria's reputation. It changed nothing that mattered. The marriage had been publicly denied, and George had let it be denied, and the woman who loved him had been sacrificed to the arithmetic of his allowance. Here, for the first time, but by no means the last, the true grain of the man showed through the charm. He had wanted Maria more than he had ever wanted anything, had pursued her to the edge of scandal and beyond, had bound himself to her by an oath he believed sacred, and then, when the choice came between her honor and his money, he had chosen his money and let another man tell the lie for him. It would become the pattern of his life, the capacity for real, even desperate feeling, and the deeper incapacity to let that feeling cost him anything he was unwilling to pay. In the years to come, he would return to Maria again and again, recalling her when he needed her, casting her off when he did not, until the final and permanent parting still decades ahead. She would outlive him and keep his letters and be buried wearing his miniature. But the wound of 1787 never entirely healed, and it marked the point at which the first gentleman of Europe first showed himself capable of a cruelty that no amount of elegance could disguise. For the moment, the maneuver worked. The marriage denied and the rumor smothered, the path to Parliament's money lay open, and the prince turned to the business of extracting it. He had spent the honor of the woman he loved to protect the fortune he had squandered, and the fortune even now was not nearly enough. The debts that had forced the denial had not gone away, they had only been postponed, and they were still climbing. What Maria's betrayal had bought was a little time, and the promise of a reckoning with his father and his father's parliament that would drag the whole squalid arithmetic of his life into the open. The love was spent, the debt remained. The debts that forced the denial of Maria Fitzherbert were not an aberration in the Prince of Wales's life. They were its most constant feature, the great fact against which every other fact eventually broke. From the moment he came into his own establishment, George spent as though money were a natural element that replenished itself overnight, and the results, within a very few years, were staggering even by the standards of an age that expected its princes to be extravagant. By the late 1780s, his obligations had swollen past £200,000 and were still rising, a sum so vast at a time when a prosperous gentleman might keep a great house and a large family in comfort on a few thousand a year that it is difficult to render it in any terms the modern ear can feel. It was not the ordinary profligacy of a young man enjoying his inheritance. It was a structural condition, a permanent hemorrhage, and it disfigured the dignity of the crown for the better part of 40 years. The money went, as it always went with George, on beauty and on pleasure in roughly equal measure. Carlton House alone was a bottomless drain, its rebuilding under Henry Holland proceeding by demolition and revision as fast as by construction, so that rooms scarcely finished were pulled apart again to satisfy a taste that never rested. The stables swallowed the price of a cavalry regiment, the wardrobes the price of a landed estate. There were the pictures and the porcelain and the plate, the jewels and the horses and the endless entertaining. And there was the gaming, the long nights at Brooks's and the tables where a fortune could vanish on the turn of a card, and frequently did. The prince paid, when he paid at all, with borrowed money, and borrowed more to service what he had borrowed before, mortgaging an inheritance he did not yet hold against the day his father would die, and the whole account fall due to the nation. That was the heart of the scandal, and it is what lifts the story above mere spendthrift comedy. George had almost no income that was truly his own. What he spent in the last resort on the public's credit, against a throne the public paid for. And so, when the creditors at last closed in and the edifice began to totter, the heir to the throne was driven to the most humiliating passage of his young life. He had to go, cap in hand, to the father he despised and beg the nation to pay his bills. The negotiations of 1787 were protracted, degrading, and entirely public. George III, whose personal thrift was a point of moral pride, met his son's appeals with cold lectures and colder conditions. Parliament, where the prince's Whig friends were glad of any stick to beat the king's government, at length agreed to a rescue, voting well over £100,000 to clear the debts, with a further large grant to finish Carlton House, but only in exchange for the prince's solemn promise to live within his means thereafter. He gave the promise with all his considerable charm and every appearance of sincerity. He broke it almost at once. For a season he made a show of reform. He shut up part of Carlton House, sold off some of his horses, and withdrew to the small seaside town of Brighton, where the sea air was thought good for his health and the living was said to be cheap, though what he began to build there would, in time, become the most expensive folly of his life. The economy was theatre, and it did not last. Within a few years, the spending had resumed its old pace, the debts were climbing again toward figures higher than before, and the cycle that would define his relations with Parliament had set into its groove. Crisis, appeal, grudging rescue, hollow promise, relapse. Each turn of the wheel cost the crown a little more of its dignity and taught the country a little more thoroughly to regard its future king as a byword for irresponsibility. And the country, by the 1790s, was in no humor to be forgiving. The France across the Channel had erupted into revolution and then into regicide, and from 1793 Britain was locked into a long and ruinous war against the new republic, a war that would grind on with brief remissions for more than 20 years. Taxes climbed, harvests failed, the price of bread rose beyond the reach of the laboring poor, and the fear of revolution at home lent every excess of the great a sharper and more dangerous edge. Against that background, the spectacle of the Prince of Wales was no longer merely absurd, the sight of his carriage rolling gilded through the mud to an entertainment that cost more than a laboring family would see in a lifetime, while men who worked went hungry and men who fought went unpaid, bred a contempt that went deeper than mockery. This was the soil in which the great satirists flourished. James Gillray and his fellow caricaturists turned the prince into the most savagely lampooned man in the kingdom. Bloated, flushed, sprawled among the wreckage of a feast, his pockets hanging empty and inside out, a monument of appetite in a hungry land. The prince were cruel, and they were exaggerated, and they were not, in their essentials, unfair. The most famous of these images has outlived almost everything else about the man. In 1792, Gillray published a print he called A Voluptuary Under the Horrors of Digestion. The Prince of Wales lolling gorged at a cleared table, waistcoat straining, an overflowing chamber pot, and a heap of unpaid bills at his side, a fork upright in the wreckage of a meal, picking his teeth in bloated contentment. It was savage, and it was unjust in the way all caricature is unjust, and it fixed an image of the prince in the national mind that no state portrait would ever quite dislodge. This was the deeper cost of the debts, beyond the pounds themselves. They made the heir to the throne first ridiculous and then contemptible, a standing joke and a standing grievance, and they did it at the precise moment when a nation at war most needed to believe in the dignity of the crown it was bleeding to defend. Every guinea lavished on Carlton House was, in effect, an argument handed to the Crown's enemies, to the radicals and reformers who pointed at the prince and asked why a hungry and heavily taxed people should keep such a man in such splendor. George never grasped that he was arming them. He believed the magnificence answered the criticism. In truth, it was the criticism's best evidence. What makes the story harder and more interesting than a simple fable of greed is that George did not think of himself as greedy at all. He believed, with a conviction that never wavered, that magnificence was a duty, that the heir to a great throne owed it to the nation to be splendid, to lead its taste, to gather the finest art and raise the finest buildings and set a standard of civilization that lesser men could only admire. There was even something to the belief. His eye was real, his patronage was real. A great part of what his money bought was genuinely beautiful, and some of it endures to this day as a public good he can fairly be credited with. He could discourse for an hour and knowledgeably on the proportion of a column or the handling of light in a Dutch interior and mean every word. But the vision was never matched by the discipline that alone could have made it honorable. He wanted to be remembered as a patron king, the maker of a golden age, and he could not grasp that a golden age built on unpayable debt and broken faith is not a legacy but a reproach. The cost of it fell on more than the treasury. It fell first on the crown itself, whose standing with its own people George spent his life eroding, every bailout a fresh insult, every broken promise a fresh proof that the word of a prince was worthless. It fell on the friends and ministers he drew into his affairs, the Whigs who championed his cause and found their own credit dragged down with his, the men of business who advanced him money and waited years to be repaid, if they were repaid at all. He used people as he used credit, drawing on them freely and settling reluctantly, and dropping them without ceremony when they had nothing more to give. There is a coldness at the center of all this that the warmth of his manner never quite reached, a man who could inspire real devotion and return almost none of it, and who seems never to have understood that loyalty, like money, cannot be spent forever without being replenished. There were casualties closer to the ground as well. Tradesmen who had extended the prince credit in good faith waited years for settlement, and some were ruined in the waiting. Jewelers, coachmakers, wine merchants, and builders learned that a royal warrant might mean a bad debt as readily as a fortune. He borrowed too from foreign bankers and from his own friends, entangling the private finances of half his circle with his own, so that his insolvency became a kind of contagion, spreading outward from Carlton House through everyone unwise enough to trust him. The prince felt none of it. Money, to George, was an element he moved through rather than a resource he possessed, and the people it broke on its way to him remained, so far as the record shows, entirely invisible to the man who had spent it. By the middle of the 1790s, the arithmetic had become insupportable. The debts now stood at a figure that even the prince's friends spoke of in tones of alarm. By conservative reckoning, well over £500,000. And there was no longer any prospect of another quiet rescue on the old terms. His father was immovable, his creditors were desperate, the public was hostile, and the war made every appeal to the public purse more offensive than the last. The prince had spent himself into a corner from which charm and borrowing could no longer extract him, and only one door remained. Parliament and the king would clear the mountain of debt on a single condition, that he give up the last freedom he had left, put away the woman he had secretly married, and take a lawful Protestant wife who would give the throne an heir. He needed the money more than he had ever needed anything, and so he agreed to sell the one thing he had left to sell and to buy his solvency at the price of a marriage he would spend the rest of his life trying to escape. The bargain that George struck in 1795 was the most cynical of his life, and it was made without a shred of pretense, even to himself. Parliament would clear his colossal debts and raise his income to something befitting his station on one condition, that he marry a suitable Protestant princess and beget an heir to the throne. He did not want a wife. He wanted his creditors silenced and his splendor restored, and he was prepared to take a wife as the price of it, much as another man might take out a loan. That he was already bound, in his own conscience and by the rights of the Church, to Maria Fitzherbert, troubled him not at all in the reckoning. That marriage was a secret and in law a nullity, and it would not pay a single bill. The lawful, loveless one would. He agreed to the terms not because he sought a family, but because he could see no other road back to solvency, and he entered upon it in a spirit that was part indifference and part calculation, and wholly loveless from the start. The choice of bride was made with a carelessness that would have been comic had its consequences not been so grave. She was Caroline of Brunswick, the prince's own first cousin, daughter of the Duke of Brunswick, and of Princess Augusta, the elder sister of George III, and she was selected, in effect, sight unseen, on the strength of her rank and her Protestant blood and the convenience of the alliance. George had never met her. It is likely that the match was pressed on him partly by his current mistress, Lady Jersey, who had her own reasons for preferring that the prince marry a woman unlikely to rival her in his affections, and who would shortly be installed with calculated cruelty in the new princess's own household. The man sent to fetch the bride from Germany, the Earl of Malmesbury, was a shrewd and experienced diplomat, and his diary of the journey survives as one of the most painful documents in the history of the monarchy, for Malmesbury saw the disaster coming weeks before it arrived and could do nothing to prevent it. He found Caroline good-natured and not unintelligent, but coarse in her manners, careless in her person, and heedless of the advice he labored to give her, and he understood, watching her, that she was being carried toward a husband who would find in her everything he most despised. The meeting, when it came, was every bit as bad as he had feared. On the 5th of April, 1795, Caroline was brought to St. James's Palace and presented to the prince. She moved, as she had been coached, to kneel. He raised her, embraced her with the briefest formality, and then, according to Malmesbury, who stood beside him, turned abruptly away, crossed the room and said in a low voice, "Harris, I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." He walked out. Caroline, left standing, remarked with more spirit than tact that she found the prince very fat and nothing like as handsome as his portrait. The recoil was instant, and it was mutual, and it never afterwards softened. For the 3 days between that meeting and the wedding, the prince is said to have fortified himself steadily against what was coming. The marriage took place on the evening of the 8th of April, 1795, in the Chapel Royal at St. James's, and it was a spectacle of misery dressed as celebration. The prince came to the altar, by every account, heavily the worse for drink, propped up, some said, by the dukes who attended him, unsteady on his feet, his eyes wandering more than once to Lady Jersey among the company. He wept during the service, though whether from feeling or from wine, no one could say. The Archbishop of Canterbury, reading the words that bound the pair together, is reported to have paused meaningfully over the passages that asked whether any impediment existed, for the whole court knew, in a general way, that there were secrets in the prince's past that the marriage service was not equipped to reach. Of the wedding night itself, only Caroline's own later account survives, and it must be taken as her word rather than as established fact. She said that her husband, insensible with drink, fell into the fireplace where he passed the night, and that she left him there. Whatever the literal truth, the union was, from its first hours, a thing without warmth, without desire, and without hope. The wretchedness did not end with the ceremony. The couple passed what should have been a honeymoon at Kempshott, in Hampshire, in the company of the prince's drinking companions, in an atmosphere Caroline afterwards remembered as more like a low tavern than a court. Worse waited for her when they returned. Lady Jersey, the prince's mistress, had been appointed a lady of the bedchamber to the new princess, placed, that is, in the intimate daily service of the wife whose marriage she had helped to arrange and now helped to poison. She pried into Caroline's letters, carried tales, meddled in her affairs, and made the humiliation of the abandoned wife a performance conducted under her own roof. Caroline, isolated in a strange country, without allies or counsel, mocked for the very coarseness her circumstances did nothing to soften, began to understand the size of the trap she had walked into. She was not blameless in what would follow. Her judgment was poor and her tongue reckless, and she would in time hand her enemies the material they wanted. But the pattern of her married life was set for her in these first weeks by her husband and his mistress, and it was a pattern of studied cruelty toward a young woman who had come to England, whatever her failings, in good faith. It would be easy, and it would be false, to make of Caroline a simple, wronged innocent, and honesty requires that both sides of her be held at once. She was, by the fastidious and merciless standards of the English court, genuinely difficult, loud where silence was expected, blunt where discretion was demanded, indifferent to the niceties of dress and hygiene that her husband raised almost to a religion, and prone all her life to indiscretions of speech and conduct that gave her enemies real material to work with. She had been raised in a small and unbuttoned German court and set down without preparation in the most scrutinizing and least forgiving society in Europe. None of that is denied, but set against it is the larger and heavier truth. She was a young woman of 26, sent across a warring continent to marry a man she had never seen, in good faith and on the promise of a crown, and she was met by a husband who had decided, before they had exchanged a dozen words, that she disgusted him, who kept his mistress in her household as a standing humiliation, who was himself a serial adulterer already secretly bound to another woman, and who abandoned her in all but the outward forms within a matter of weeks. Whatever Caroline was or would become, she did not deserve the man she was given, and she had done nothing to earn his contempt but exist. The marriage produced exactly one result before it collapsed, and that result was a daughter. Almost precisely 9 months after the wedding, on the 7th of January, 1796, Caroline was delivered of a healthy girl, Princess Charlotte, the only legitimate child George would ever father, and after her father, the heir to the throne. The dynasty had what it had bargained for. The debt-clearing marriage had done its single duty, and with that duty discharged, the prince felt himself free of any further obligation to the woman who had performed it. Within a few months of the birth, he addressed to Caroline a cold and formal letter releasing them both from what he called a connection of the most unpleasant nature, and declaring that their private union was at an end, whatever the world might be told. They would keep separate establishments and lead separate lives. There would be no reconciliation, no second child, no truce, only a long and deepening enmity that the birth of their daughter had done nothing to soften and much to sharpen. Almost from the moment of the separation, the public instinct ran against him. Londoners who knew nothing of the private truth knew enough to see an abandoned wife and a self-indulgent husband, and they made their feelings plain. The prince was hissed in the streets and at the theatre, while Caroline, appearing in public, was cheered. The estranged princess set up a household of her own, in time at Blackheath on the edge of the capital, and there, proud, wounded, idle, and imprudent, she began to live as she pleased, gathering about her a miscellaneous circle and conducting herself with a freedom that scandalized the court. Her fondness for the company of young children, several of whom she took into her care, would in 1806 be twisted into the pretext for the first great secret inquiry into her conduct, the so-called delicate investigation, got up expressly to find grounds against her. It found little that would stand in law. But it was the opening move in a campaign of surveillance and suspicion that George would prosecute on and off for the next 15 years. For George, the arrangement was a liberation, and he returned to the life he preferred without a backward glance, to Carlton House and its endless refinements, to his collections and his mistresses and the company of men who did not contradict him, conducting himself as though the marriage had been a brief, unpleasant transaction now safely concluded. He had got his money, he could dispense with the wife. But he had made a serious and characteristic error of judgment, and it would take him years to grasp the size of it. He imagined that Caroline, discarded, would fade quietly into the margins of the court and trouble him no further. She would do nothing of the kind. She had a title, a legal standing, a daughter who was heir to the throne, and, as the world would come to see, a growing sense of the wrong that had been done her, and a temperament wholly unsuited to suffering it in silence. In seeking to be rid of her, George had not disposed of a nuisance. He had made an enemy for life, one whose grievance was real and whose cause the public would one day take up against him with a fury that shook the throne. And in the very act of turning his back on his wife, he was turning it also on his infant daughter, the one wholly innocent party to the whole squalid bargain, and the one who would be broken between her parents before she was grown. She was born into a broken house, and she was used, from her first days, as a weapon in the war that had broken it. Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales came into the world at Carlton House on the 7th of January, 1796, the only legitimate child of the Prince of Wales and, after him, second in line to the throne of a great empire. She should have been the one thing capable of binding her parents together. Instead, she became the ground they fought over. Within months of her birth, her father had separated from her mother, and the infant princess was left suspended between them, claimed by both, loved steadily by neither, and turned by each into an instrument for wounding the other. It was a childhood arranged for the convenience of a quarrel, and it shaped everything she became. The practical cruelty of her situation was that she belonged to neither parent and could be kept from both. Custody and control lay, in the end, with her father, and George exercised that control less out of affection than out of a jealous unwillingness to let her mother have her. Caroline's access to her own daughter was rationed and supervised. Charlotte was established with governesses and sub-governesses in a household of her own, at Warwick House beside Carlton House and at Windsor under the eye of her grandparents, and raised in a strange half-isolation. The most important child in the kingdom, and one of the loneliest. Her grandfather, the old king, was kind to her in the years before his mind gave way. Her father was by turns possessive and neglectful, attentive when it suited his purposes and absent when it did not. She grew up watching the adults around her maneuver for possession of her, and she learned early to have a will of her own, because no one else's will was reliably exercised on her behalf. That will made her, as she grew, into something the House of Hanover had not lately produced, a figure the public could love without irony. Charlotte was warm, headstrong, impulsive, and transparently sincere, awkward in her manners, careless of decorum, and entirely without her father's polish, but possessed of a directness and a good heart that the nation found irresistible precisely because it was so unlike the glittering coldness at the center of the Regency. She was the future, and she was a hopeful one, proof that the line might yet produce a sovereign the people could respect. As her father's unpopularity deepened through the Regency years, pelted in the streets, savaged in the press, sunk in debt and self-indulgence, his daughter's standing rose in exact and pointed contrast. The country looked at George and despaired. It looked at Charlotte and allowed itself to hope. The clash between them was inevitable because she had inherited from him the one quality he could least tolerate in others, the refusal to be governed. In 1814, her father attempted to arrange her future as a diplomatic transaction, pressing her into a betrothal with the Prince of Orange that would in time have carried her off to Holland. Charlotte, who had no wish to leave England or to abandon her disgraced mother to her father's mercies, broke the engagement off, and when the pressure on her became intolerable, she did something no princess was supposed to do. She fled. One evening she ran out of her father's house, hailed a common hackney cab in the street, and drove to her mother's residence, throwing the whole royal establishment into uproar and forcing a public reckoning before she could be persuaded back. It was an extraordinary act of rebellion, and the public, hearing of it, sided with her almost to a man. In the daughter's flight from the father they saw their own feelings about him made flesh. For a time the flight cost her dearly. She was brought back, and her father answered her defiance by tightening the cage, her household broken up, her attendants dismissed, and she herself removed for a season to seclusion at Cranbourne Lodge in Windsor Forest, cut off from the mother she had risked so much to reach and from the public that adored her. Caroline, for her part, chose that same year to leave England altogether, departing in 1814 for the Continent and the wandering, ill-judged exile that would one day be turned into the case against her, so that the daughter lost her mother not to death but to distance, and was left more alone than before. Yet Charlotte endured the confinement with a steadiness that impressed even those set to guard her, and when the question of her marriage was reopened, she had won, in practice, the right to a voice in it. She met Prince Leopold, weighed him, and settled on him with the same directness she brought to everything. The nation, which had followed every turn of her rebellion, followed her courtship too, and when the match was at last agreed, it was greeted not as a dynastic arrangement, but as the reward of a young woman who had held out for her own happiness against the whole weight of her father's will. When at last she was allowed to choose, she chose for love, and the nation rejoiced with her. The man was Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a minor German prince, handsome, serious, and comparatively poor, with none of the great dynastic weight the matchmakers had wanted for her, but a man Charlotte had settled her heart upon and would not be moved from. They were married on the 2nd of May, 1816, and the marriage was, against every precedent of her family, a happy one. The couple withdrew to Claremont, a country house in Surrey, and lived there with a quietness and a mutual devotion that struck the public as almost radical in its simplicity, a deliberate rebuke, though they may not have meant it so, to the grotesque expense and disorder of Carlton House and Brighton. For a little more than a year, the country watched them with something like tenderness. The succession seemed secure, the future bright, the long tawdry cycle of royal misbehavior, at last perhaps broken. When it became known that Charlotte was expecting a child, the joy was national and unfeigned. What followed was one of the great catastrophes of the age, and it should be told plainly, without ornament, because the plain facts are heavy enough. Charlotte's labor began at Claremont at the start of November 1817, and went on, without progressing, for some 50 hours. The physicians in attendance, cautious to the point of paralysis and fearful of intervening, let it run its course. At last, in the evening of the 5th of November, she was delivered of a large, stillborn son. She seemed at first to have come through the ordeal, and then, in the early hours of the 6th of November, she began to bleed and could not be saved, and a few hours later she was dead. She was 21 years old. In a single night the throne had lost, at one stroke, the heir of the next generation and the heir of the one after, the beloved princess and the son who would have followed her, and the physician who had presided, broken by the blame that fell on him, took his own life some months afterwards. It was called at the time a triple tragedy, and the name was exact. The grief that broke over the country had no measure in living memory. Charlotte had been the future, and the future had been erased in an evening. Shops closed, church bells tolled across every county. Even the poorest households found a scrap of black to wear. The shelves of the drapers were emptied of mourning cloth. Men and women who had never seen her wept in the streets for a princess they had come to think of as their own. And as the personal loss it was, so was it something colder and larger, the sudden collapse of the dynastic future. For with Charlotte gone, and no other legitimate grandchild of the old king in existence, the succession simply fell away into vacancy. The consequence was a spectacle at once desperate and faintly absurd. The middle-aged royal dukes, George's brothers, long settled in comfortable irregularity with their mistresses, were now urged by duty and by Parliament to put those households aside, marry suitable princesses in haste, and get legitimate heirs before the line ran out. From that unseemly scramble to the altar would come, within 2 years, the child who would one day be Queen Victoria, the whole shape of the century to follow, set in motion by the death of the young woman at Claremont. For George himself, the blow was genuine, and it was tangled past unraveling with everything he had failed to be. He had not been a good father to Charlotte. He had been distant and controlling, jealous of her affection and careless of her happiness, a man who had used her in his quarrel with her mother and tried to dispose of her in his diplomacy. And yet, when the news reached him, he was, by every account, prostrate, overwhelmed, unable to compose himself, too shattered even to attend her funeral. It is possible to hold both of these things together, and one ought to, because that doubleness is the truth of him. The grief was real, so was the fact that he had done little to earn a share in the loss. He mourned a daughter he had never troubled to know, and perhaps mourned, in her, the better man he might have been and the life he had squandered. Whatever moved in him that November, it did not last, and it did not reform him. He withdrew instead into himself, into the fog of brandy and laudanum and self-pity that would thicken over his remaining years, and the death that might have chastened another man served only to hollow him further. Charlotte's death cleared the last obstacle between George and the throne he had waited a lifetime to inherit, for the reign now hurrying toward him would no longer pass through her, but it took from him, in the same stroke, the one tie of natural affection that had bound him, however imperfectly, to the ordinary feelings of his people, the one relationship in which he might still have been redeemed in their eyes. He was left with his debts, his grievances, and his loathed and estranged wife, still living, still legally his, still to be reckoned with. And it was toward that final reckoning with Caroline and with the whole squandered account of his life that the widowed and childless prince now moved, as the old king's long twilight drew at last toward its close. The madness that finally handed George his power began, as so much in his story did, with a death inside the family. In the autumn of 1810, the king's youngest and best-loved child, the Princess Amelia, died after a long and wasting illness, and the old man's reason, which had cracked and mended twice before, broke and this time did not mend. Those who attended him in those weeks described a grief that slid past sorrow into derangement, the king weeping without pause, talking to the dead as though they stood in the room, his mind loosed at last from its moorings. By the opening of 1811, it was plain that George III would not return, and that the government of a nation locked in its long war against Napoleon could not be conducted by a phantom. Parliament did what the king's own recovery had spared it from doing a generation earlier in the crisis of 1788. It passed a Regency, and on the 5th of February 1811, the Prince of Wales, at 48, became at last the ruler of his father's kingdom. It was not, however, the unfettered power he had craved. Mindful that the old king had twice climbed back from the edge, the ministers hedged the Regency with restrictions for its first year, withholding from the prince the fuller prerogatives of the crown until it was certain his father would not recover. And there was a deeper strangeness in the arrangement, one that would shadow the whole decade. George now governed in the name of a man he had spent his life resenting, ruling for a father who was not dead but merely absent, shut away at Windsor beyond the reach of either recovery or release. The son who had waited so long for the throne found that he had been given the labor of a king and denied the title, and that the wait, far from ending, had only changed its shape. For the men who had gathered around him through the long years of opposition, the moment was supposed to be a vindication. The Whigs, the party of reform and of the late Charles James Fox, who had died in 1806, had made the reversion of the prince the foundation of their hopes. They had championed his causes and excused his debts, flattered his grievances against his father, and told themselves and him that when the Regency came, they would come with it, born into office on his gratitude. It was the great wager of their political lives. They had only to wait, and the waiting was nearly done. The prince did not pay the debt. When the Regency began, he left the Tory ministry of Spencer Perceval undisturbed, and when the restrictions on his power lapsed in February 1812, and he was free at last to summon whom he pleased, he did not summon them. He sent instead a cautious overture to the Whig leaders, Lord Grey and Lord Grenville, inviting them not to govern, but to join a broadened administration on terms that preserved the men and measures already in place, terms they could not in honor accept and did not. In May 1812, Percival was shot dead in the lobby of the House of Commons, and in the reshuffling that followed, the Prince Regent had a second clear chance to bring in his old friends. He confirmed the Tories once more, and the ministry of Lord Liverpool, which the Whigs had assumed the Regency would sweep away, settled in for 15 years. The party that had staked everything on the prince's loyalty was left standing, as one of them bitterly put it, in the cold. There were reasons a careful man might have given. It was perilous to change the whole direction of a government in the middle of a war for national survival. The Whigs were pledged to Catholic emancipation, which the prince, who had once toyed with the cause to spite his father, now found it convenient to abandon, and his closest confidant of these years, the Tory Lady Hertford, drew him steadily toward the establishment. But beneath the reasons lay the plainer truth that the men who had served his interest had ceased to be useful to it, and that this was, for George, sufficient. It was entirely of a piece with the man who had let Fox deny the marriage to Maria Fitzherbert on the floor of the Commons to protect his allowance. Loyalty, offered to him in abundance, ran only one way. To the men themselves it was a wound that did not close. For a generation, the friendship of the prince had been the great asset of their careers, the promissory note they carried through every year in the wilderness, and now at the moment it fell due it was dishonored. They had mistaken a convenience for a conviction. The prince had attached himself to the opposition not because he shared its principles, but because opposition was the natural home of a son at war with his father, and when the war with the father guttered out into the long vigil at Windsor, the alliance that had fed on it lost its reason to exist. Some of them never forgave it, and the sourness of the betrayed clung to the Regency's politics for years. It was one thing, they had learned, to be loved by the Prince of Wales, and quite another to be able to depend upon it. The age he now presided over has come down to us, wrapped in amber, the Regency of elegance and wit, of Jane Austen and Beau Brummel, of the long, clean lines of Nash's terraces. Much of that was real, and some of it was genuinely his. It was under the Regent's patronage that John Nash drove Regent Street through the heart of London and laid out the park that still bears the title. And the prince's eye for the beautiful left a lasting mark on the capital. But for the man at the center of it, the decade was above all a lesson in being hated. The war ended in 1815 on the field of Waterloo, in a victory that released 20 years of accumulated dread, a victory won by the Duke of Wellington and the armies of the coalition, in which the Regent had played no soldier's part, though in the confused and self-flattering years to come he would begin, it was said, to remember it otherwise. The peace that followed brought not relief but hardship. Bad harvests, the Corn Laws of 1815 that kept bread dear to protect the landed interest, demobilized soldiers thrown onto an empty labor market, and a swelling, angry demand for reform. Against that background, the sight of the Regent, vast, corseted, rouged building palaces became intolerable. He was hissed in the streets that had once cheered him. In January 1817, returning from opening Parliament, the windows of his carriage were broken, whether by stones or by shot, no one could afterwards agree, and the incident was used to justify a suspension of the ancient protections of liberty. Worst of all, in August 1819, when the yeomanry cut down an unarmed crowd gathered for reform at St. Peter's Field in Manchester, the massacre the radicals named Peterloo, in bitter mockery of the great victory, the Prince Regent conveyed, through his ministers, his thanks and approbation to the magistrates who had ordered it. The government answered the country's anger not with redress but with the repressive measures the reformers called the Gagging Acts, tightening the law against public meetings and the cheap press alike. To a great part of the nation, the Golden Regency and the man who gave it his name had come to mean the sabre and the closed hand. The press, finding its teeth in a newly literate age, said aloud what the streets were muttering. When a fawning newspaper, the Morning Post, published a birthday tribute praising the Regent as a paragon of every virtue, an Adonis in loveliness, the journalist Leigh Hunt answered in his own paper, The Examiner, with a reply that has outlived every compliment the Post ever printed. This glory of the people, Hunt wrote, this Adonis in loveliness, was in truth a corpulent gentleman of 50, a violator of his word, a libertine over head and ears in debt and disgrace, a despiser of domestic ties, the companion of gamblers and demi-reps, a man who has just closed half a century without one single claim on the gratitude of his country or the respect of posterity. It was not caricature, it was, point for point, the record. For it, the Regent reached for the law. Hunt and his brother John, who published the Examiner with him, were tried for seditious libel and in 1813 sentenced each to 2 years' imprisonment and a fine of £500. But the punishment did more for Hunt's cause than for the Crown's. He turned his cell into a kind of shrine to defiance, papering the walls with a trellis of roses, filling it with books and a piano, and receiving there a procession of the age's finest minds, Byron and Moore and Lamb among them, who came to pay their respects to a man jailed for telling the truth about the heir to the throne. The Regent had proved only that he could imprison a critic. He had not touched the thing the critic said, which every print shop window in London now repeated in coloured caricature. He had become a man who governed his reputation, so far as he governed it at all, through fear, because he could no longer command respect. And through all of it, the central fact of his position did not change. He had the labour of a king and not the name of one. Somewhere in the quiet apartments at Windsor, his father lived on, blind now and deaf and lost to reason, a white-bearded old man in a dressing gown playing to himself on the harpsichord and holding conversations with the dead, beyond deposing, beyond curing, and beyond hurrying. The son had rebelled against that father for half a century, had run up debts to defy him, married in secret to defy him, thrown himself into wine and women and the opposition to defy him, and now, at the height of his power, he found himself ruling in the old man's shadow and bearing the old man's name, waiting still as he had waited all his life for a death that would not come. The crown he had craved since boyhood hung a single heartbeat away, and that heartbeat, maddeningly, went on. The Regent could command armies and appoint ministers and raise palaces. The one thing he could not do was become the king. For that he would have to keep waiting. If any building on earth was the outward form of George's inward life, it stood on the seafront at Brighton. He had first come to the little Sussex bathing town as a young man in the 1780s, drawn by the fashion for sea air, by the racing and the gaming, and, it was widely believed, by the presence nearby of Maria Fitzherbert. What began as a modest farmhouse he rented grew, under the architect Henry Holland, into a neat classical villa, the Brighton Pavilion, and Brighton itself, following its prince, grew with it from a fishing village into the most fashionable resort in England. But the classical villa was only a beginning. Over more than 30 years, and at a cost that mounted into figures no one could defend, George rebuilt it again and again, until it became the strangest and most original great house in the kingdom. The turn toward the east had in fact begun not with the house but with the horses. In the first years of the new century, George had the architect William Porden raise beside the modest villa a set of royal stables and a riding house in the Indian manner, crowned by a great glass and iron dome that was, when it rose, among the boldest structures in the country. The effect was faintly absurd. The prince's horses were now lodged in a palace grander than the prince, and the plain classical villa stood shamed beside its own outbuildings. Something had to be done to bring the house up to the splendor of the stables, and the answer, when George found the man to give it, would be more extravagant than anyone had imagined. The transformation that made it famous was the work of John Nash, carried out in the years after Waterloo. Nash cased the old house in a fantasia drawn from the east, a skyline of onion domes and slender minarets, of pierced stonework and tent-like roofs, an Indian silhouette set down improbably against the grey English Channel. Nothing quite like it had been built in Europe. It answered to no rule of the reigning classical taste. It obeyed only the imagination of the man who commissioned it, and it is easy, looking at it, to see why sober ministers thought their regent had taken leave of his senses. Yet it must be granted what it was owed, for the legend that files George under folly does the building an injustice. The pavilion was not a rich man's whim thrown up by tradesmen. It was a genuine and daring work of art, the product of a real and educated eye, and it has outlasted almost every graver monument of its age. Inside, the daring went further still. Nash and his craftsmen hung the great rooms with a chinoiserie of astonishing richness, the music room ceiling scaled like the inside of a vast shell, dragons writhing up the columns and holding the chandeliers in their claws, a banqueting room lit by a lustre that seemed to hang from the leaves of a silvered plantain tree. Behind the fantasy lay real invention. The domes were carried on a hidden frame of cast iron, the newest structural art of the age, and the enormous kitchen was roofed on iron columns crowned with copper palm fronds, a working room built with the ambition of a state apartment. It was theatrical, and it was excessive, and it was also, beyond any argument, beautiful. Proof, if proof were wanted, that the man the cartoons drew as a mound of appetite carried in him a connoisseur of rare and confident taste. That was one half of the truth, and the film owes it plainly. The other half was inseparable from it. The pavilion rose through the years of hardest peace, while demobilized soldiers begged in the lanes, and the price of bread was kept high by law, and every gilded dragon and lacquered panel was paid for out of a purse the nation ultimately guaranteed. The genius and the irresponsibility were not two things but one. The same refusal to reckon cost against desire that made the interiors sublime made them also a standing scandal. A poorer man of the same gifts would have been merely a great patron of taste. A prince who could draw on the public credit became something harder to forgive. A connoisseur whose masterpieces were built on other men's want. And yet the masterpieces were real, and they endured. When the debts were long forgotten and the caricatures had yellowed in their folios, the pavilion would still stand on its seafront, absurd and magnificent, drawing visitors who came to wonder at it, the most honest monument the man ever raised because it hid nothing of him, neither the genuine vision nor the boundless want, set down together in stone and iron for anyone to read. And the appetite that raised the pavilion filled it as well. George's table at Brighton became a marvel and a byword. For a season in these years, the greatest cook in Europe, Marie-Antoine Carême, the man they called the King of Chefs and the Chef of Kings, presided over the regent's kitchens and set before him banquets of 100 dishes and more, soups and roasts and fantastical spun-sugar architectures built to be admired before they were destroyed. Here again the two halves met. The meals were at once the sincere delight of a genuine epicure who had lured the finest talent in Europe to his ovens, and the ruinous indulgence of a man who no longer knew when to stop. The banquets were staged like theatre, course upon course carried in over hours, the whole set off by sugar temples and pastry ruins that were themselves small feats of architecture, so that the pavilion's kitchen answered its domes and dragons dish for dish. He ate enormously, and he drank deep, brandy and cherry brandy and fortified wine in quantities that alarmed his physicians, and the eating and the drinking were, more and more, the business of his days. What had once been the pleasure of a cultivated table had thickened by degrees into something closer to compulsion, a hunger that the finest cookery in Europe was set to feed and could never satisfy, because the thing it reached for was not on any plate. The body paid the reckoning. The slender, graceful prince who had turned every head at Carlton House 30 years before had disappeared inside a great, laboring bulk. By report, his waist passed 50 inches, and he was laced each morning into stays that the caricaturists gleefully christened a Bastille of whalebone. He was racked by gout, until crossing a room was a labor, and the swellings and breathlessness of dropsy were beginning their slow siege of him. The first gentleman of Europe, the arbiter of every fashion, had become a man corseted and rouged and propped, hiding a failing frame beneath the last defenses of his vanity. To carry the pain, and to quiet nerves that had never been strong, he turned increasingly to laudanum, the tincture of opium that was the age's universal remedy. It eased the gout and the sleeplessness. It also, drop by drop, drew a soft grey curtain between him and the world. Under its influence, the criticism of the press grew faint, the coldness of his ministers grew bearable, and the grief he carried, for his daughter Charlotte, dead in 1817, and for the wreck of everything he had once promised to be, could be smoothed into something like calm. But the calm had a price that would come due in his last years, a slow loosening of his hold on the real, a drift toward the self-flattering dreams and confabulations that would in time make him claim victories he had never won. The wasted man that the Recluse of Windsor would become was already, in the opium-scented rooms at Brighton, beginning to show. Meanwhile, the print shop windows of London made him the most savagely lampooned human being in the country. The archetype had been set a generation earlier by the cruelest genius of the trade, James Gillray, whose Voluptuary under the Horrors of Digestion of 1792 had already drawn the young prince as a bloated glutton picking his teeth amid the ruins of a feast, an image made before the fat was truly earned, and prophetic for that reason. Gillray's own reason failed before the Regency was old, but the tradition he founded was carried on with relish by George Cruikshank and his brother, by Rowlandson and a swarm of lesser hands through the whole reign. They drew the Regent gorging, the Regent drunk, the Regent bursting his buttons, the Regent as a whale, as a toad, as a swollen crown perched on a mountain of debt. The English liberty of the press, which he could not silence and largely did not try to, ensured that no monarch in Europe was ever so relentlessly, so publicly, and so accurately mocked. The savagery had a meaning beyond mischief. In his younger days, the cartoons had teased a fashionable spendthrift. Now they arraigned him. The satire hardened as the country's temper hardened, and the contrast it drew grew pointed and moral. The gorging king in his pleasure dome on one side, and on the other the cold hearths and empty tables of a people scraping through the hungry years of the peace. Each new print in the shop windows chipped a little more from the old, half-instinctive loyalty that had once surrounded the crown, and taught a literate nation to look at its future king and laugh, and then to look again and be angry. He remained, for the most part, walled off from the storm. He kept about him a small, careful circle whose office was to feed his comforts and turn away whatever might disturb them, and within that circle he could believe the performance he had staged for himself, the great king, the misunderstood patron, the first gentleman of the age. But the walls were thinner than they looked, and the reckoning was near. He had spent a life running from the plain, dutiful man his father had wished him to be, and he had run so far and so successfully that he had arrived at this, a corseted, gout-ridden, opiate-softened figure in a palace of painted dragons, adored by hirelings and despised by a kingdom, the most beautiful house in England raised around the loneliest man in it. The private world of Brighton could hold the truth at bay a little longer. It could not hold it off forever, for far away across the continent, the wife he had spent a quarter of a century trying to bury was still alive, and still, in the eyes of the law, his own, and she was coming home. There was in George a hunger to be loved that never in his long life found a bottom, and it was this, more than any coldness, that made him so faithless to the people who loved him. He needed adoration as other men need air, and he could win it almost at will, for the charm was real and the warmth in the moment was real too. But the need was all inward-facing. It drew devotion toward him and gave little back, and when a friend or a woman or a minister ceased to feed it, grew inconvenient or merely stale, he could set them aside with a completeness that looked, from the outside, like cruelty and was in truth something stranger, a selfishness so entire that the claims of others simply did not register. He was not a man without feeling. He was a man whose feeling ran always and only toward his own comfort, and that is a colder thing than coldness. The Whigs had learned it in the great matter of the Regency, when the friends of 30 years were dropped the moment their friendship stopped paying. But the pattern showed as plainly and more pitiably in smaller lives. Among the wits and talkers who had made the Prince's rooms the liveliest in London was Richard Brinsley Sheridan, playwright, orator, the author of comedies that outlived their age, and for decades one of George's most devoted companions and defenders. Sheridan had served the Prince's cause with his tongue and his pen, and had beggared himself in the doing of it, and when the end came for him, it came in squalor. In 1816 he lay dying in a stripped house with the bailiffs at the door, an officer, it was said, ready to carry him off for debt from his very deathbed, while the prince he had served so long did little, and that little too late. Sheridan was buried with pomp once he was safely dead, carried to Westminster Abbey by the great men who had let him sink. It was a lesson the whole circle might have read. The prince's favor was a warm fire to sit beside, and no shelter at all when the weather turned. The clearest emblem of the thing was Beau Brummel. No one had done more to make the legend of George's elegance than Brummel, the commoner who ruled the fashion of an empire from the bow window of a club and taught the first gentleman of Europe how a gentleman should dress. For years the two were inseparable, the arbiter and his royal pupil. Then the friendship cooled, as George's friendships did, and cooled into open insult. And Brummel, cut dead by the prince at a crowded assembly, is said to have turned to their mutual friend and asked, in a voice pitched to carry, "Who's your fat friend?" It was the wit of a man who knew he was already ruined, and ruined he duly was, driven abroad by his own gambling debts in 1816, sinking through the long years of exile into poverty, and at the last into madness, to die in a French asylum in 1840, penniless and half forgotten. His fall was in large part his own doing, but the ease with which the prince he had adorned discarded him and left him to it was entirely George's. The two men had risen together on the same tide of style, the one lending the other the very manner by which the world knew him. And when the tide turned, the prince kept the manner and dropped the man, as though a friendship were a coat that could be worn out and thrown off once its cut had been copied. It was the whole of him in miniature, the generosity that was really appetite, the intimacy that was really use, and over all of it, from first to last, stood the figure of Maria Fitzherbert, the wife of his conscience, the one attachment that had in it something like the shape of a true marriage, and the one he betrayed most often and most deeply. He had married her in secret in 1785 against every law and interest, and within 2 years had let Charles James Fox deny that marriage on the floor of the Commons to protect his income, leaving her to bear in silence the character of a mistress when she believed herself, before God, a wife. He cast her off altogether in the middle 1790s, when Lady Jersey caught his fancy and the bargain with Caroline of Brunswick beckoned with its promise of paid debts. That should have been the end. It was not because the pull between them was genuine, and because Maria, who obtained in time a ruling from Rome that eased her conscience and let her hold herself his lawful wife, was willing, against the counsel of everyone who loved her, to take him back. For a few years around the turn of the century they lived together again in something close to contentment, and those were perhaps the steadiest years the man ever knew. Then the old pattern returned. As the new century wore on, his attention drifted to the stately, mature charms of Lady Hertford, and Maria was made to feel the chill. The final humiliation was almost ceremonial in its exactness. In June 1811, to inaugurate his regency, George gave a vast fête at Carlton House, and Maria, who at his table had always sat in the place of honor facing him, was told that on this occasion the guests would be seated by their rank, and that hers gave her no place near him at all. She understood the message precisely as it was meant to be understood. She did not go, and she did not return. After a quarter of a century, the marriage of his conscience ended not in a quarrel, but in a seating plan. He never entirely let her go, in the strange, one-sided way that was the most of himself he could give. He settled an annuity on her and left her, when the storms of his life allowed, unmolested, and there was a coda that his defenders have always treasured and his accusers have never quite explained away. It was reported, on the authority of the Duke of Wellington, who was present at the laying out, that when George died, he was found to be wearing next to his heart a locket with Maria Fitzherbert's portrait in it, and that at his own wish it was buried with him. Whatever it proves, it does not prove constancy. A man may carry a woman's likeness to the grave and have failed her every year she lived. Perhaps it proves only that he knew somewhere beneath the wreckage exactly what he had thrown away. The mistresses who came and went in Maria's long shadow met, in their turn, the same law. Lady Jersey, who had helped poison his marriage to Caroline at its very source and had ruled him for a season, was herself discarded when her use was spent, and the public loathing she attracted made her a liability. Lady Hertford, who had displaced Maria and drawn him toward the Tories, held her place for a decade and then found herself supplanted in her turn, in his last years, by Lady Conyngham, a comfortable, acquisitive woman who presided over the bloated, failing close of the reign and was widely believed to be gathering jewels and favors against the day the fire went out. Each had been for her time the whole of his confidence and the arbiter of his mood. Each learned that the confidence was lent, not given, and could be called back without notice or apology. There was a melancholy symmetry in it. The man who could not keep faith with anyone attracted, in the end, companions who kept no faith with him, and the last of his loves waited beside his deathbed, less in grief than in inventory. He had spent his life teaching those around him that attachment to him was a transaction, and by the close he was surrounded by people who had learned the lesson well. What is to be made of such a man is not that he was a monster, for he plainly was not. He wept easily and genuinely. He could be moved to real tenderness by music, by a picture, by a kindness done him. He inspired, in those he chose to charm, a devotion that many of them kept long after he had ceased to deserve it. The trouble was that none of this feeling ever quite reached across the space between himself and another person. It curved back, always, toward his own comfort and his own wounded sense of himself. He could grieve for a friend and neglect him living. He could adore a woman and abandon her. He could break a heart and be sincerely astonished at the reproach. What made the spectacle sadder rather than merely contemptible was that so many of those he used went on loving him after all reason to had gone, Maria to her annuity and her locket, the Whigs to their long, aggrieved fidelity to his memory, servants and hangers-on who spoke of his kindness with tears. He had a gift for being forgiven that was almost the equal of his gift for giving offense, and he drew on it without shame as he drew on every other line of credit, certain there would always be more. His charm was not a lie exactly, but it was an instrument. It secured what he wanted in the moment and left the reckoning for others to pay. And so he moved through his life, shedding the people who had served and loved him, and telling himself more and more a kinder story, that he was the wronged one, the misunderstood one, a great man failed by lesser friends and an ungrateful nation. By the time he came to the throne, there was almost no one left of whom he had not, in some fashion, made an enemy or a servant or a ghost. He had burned the Whigs, buried Sheridan, driven off Brummel, and let Maria go. He had spent a lifetime proving that loyalty to him was a debt that ran one way and was never repaid. But there was one bond he had not been able to shed, one person who would not be paid off or seated below the salt or quietly abandoned into exile, because she was fixed to him by the law itself, and because she had at last resolved to hold him to it. He had married Caroline of Brunswick for money and abandoned her within weeks, and for 25 years he had tried by every means to be rid of her. Now he was to be king, and she was to be queen, and the last and largest of his betrayals was about to be dragged before the whole nation into the light. The death of George III, when it came as the quiet ending of something that had ended long before. For nearly 10 years the old king had lived shut away in a suite of rooms at Windsor, blind at the last from cataract, deaf and lost past recall to the madness that had taken him in 1810. A white-bearded old man in a dressing gown, playing the harpsichord to himself, holding long grave conversations with courtiers 30 years dead. His wife, Queen Charlotte, worn out by the long watch, had died in 1818 without his knowing it. And only 6 days before his own end, his fourth son, the Duke of Kent, died suddenly of a chill, leaving behind an 8-month-old daughter named Victoria, of whom as yet no one took particular notice. On the 29th of January, 1820, in the dark of a winter evening, the old king's long imprisonment in his own ruined mind was over, and the son, who had waited half a century for the crown, had it at last. He was 57 years old, and the crown brought him almost nothing that he had dreamed it would. The rebellion of his whole life had been aimed at this succession. He had run up his debts, married in secret, thrown in his lot with the opposition, and endured the long humiliation of the Regency, all against the day when the old man at Windsor should die and leave him free. Now the day had come, and he was too worn, too ill, and too hated to feel it as a triumph. There was a bitter completeness in the way the long war of father and son had ended. The father had been frugal, faithful, and dutiful, and had gone mad and blind and been mourned for all his failings as a good man and a wronged one. The son had been none of those things and inherited a nation that had already made up its mind about him. George III, at the last, was pitied. George IV would be endured. The son had won the crown he coveted, only to discover that the father had left him, along with it, a people who measured the new king against the old, and found him wanting. Within weeks of his accession, he himself fell gravely ill. A heavy cold turned to something worse, and for a time his own life was thought to be in danger, so that the reign opened not with a coronation but with a sickbed. When he rose from it, King George IV, in fact as well as in name, he brought to the throne the same swollen body, the same mountain of debt, the same unpopularity, and above all, the same single fixed and consuming purpose that had gripped him for a quarter of a century, to be rid of his wife. For now that he was king, Caroline of Brunswick was queen of England by the same law that had made him king, entitled to her place, her name in the prayers of the church, her crown at his coronation. It was intolerable to him, and he moved against it at once. Among the first business he pressed upon his ministers was that the Queen's name should be struck from the liturgy, so that congregations across the land would no longer be asked to pray for her, and the cabinet reluctantly agreed to the omission. It was a small and vindictive stroke, and it was also a public one, a signal read the length of the country that the new king meant to unqueen his wife in the face of the nation. What he wanted, beyond the liturgy, was nothing less than a divorce. The marriage he had entered only for money dissolved by law, and Caroline branded before the world as an adulteress. He believed he had the means to do it. For years, Caroline had been living abroad, wandering through France and Italy and the eastern Mediterranean with a household of her own gathering, and her conduct there had given the gossip of Europe a great deal to work with. Chief among her companions was a handsome, low-born Italian named Bartolomeo Pergami, whom she had taken up as a courier and swiftly raised to the head of her household, heaping on him honors and an order of chivalry she had half invented for the purpose. Whether the intimacy was what it appeared, no one outside it could say for certain, but it was flagrant and unwise, and it handed her enemies exactly the weapon they were looking for. Here the film must hold its balance, as the honest record does. Caroline was no wronged innocent. She was coarse, heedless of appearances, and genuinely reckless in her foreign life, and she gave real cause for the scandal that clung to her. What made her husband's campaign against her monstrous was not that she was blameless. It was that he was not. That a man who had married her for her dowry, abandoned her within weeks, and kept a train of mistresses across 30 years, now proposed to spend the power of the state to destroy her for the very kind of conduct he had made the pattern of his own life. This was not in truth the first time he had set the law to hunt her. Back in 1806, while he was still Prince of Wales, rumors that Caroline had taken lovers and even borne a child had prompted a secret inquiry, the so-called delicate investigation conducted by a panel of the king's ministers, which had raked over her conduct and found the gravest charge against her unproven, though it left her reputation clouded and her enemies unsatisfied. That earlier campaign had failed to give him what he wanted. Now, as king, he meant to try again with heavier weapons. To arm himself, he had already, 2 years before his accession, set the machinery quietly in motion. In 1818, a body of commissioners had been dispatched to Milan to gather evidence against the princess, the so-called Milan Commission, and there they had spent months collecting the depositions of servants, boatmen, and hangers-on, many of them foreign, most of them paid, all of them willing to swear to what they had seen or claimed to have seen of the princess and her courier. The harvest of their labors came back to London sealed in green bags, and those green bags, laid before Parliament, would become one of the ugliest emblems of the reign, the evidence of hired witnesses brought abroad to blacken an Englishman's wife. His ministers dreaded what he was asking of them. Lord Liverpool and his colleagues could count the cost of a public divorce as their master could not. To prove Caroline's adultery in open court would be to invite her to prove his. The whole squalid history of the marriage and of his own life would be dragged through the highest tribunal in the land, and the crown itself would be dragged with it. They urged delay, compromise, an arrangement, anything but the open trial, he demanded. But George was not to be reasoned with on this one subject. He pressed, he sulked, he threatened. He let it be known that ministers who would not free him of Caroline might not remain his ministers long. He had subordinated everything else in his life to his own comfort, and now, as king, he was prepared to subordinate the peace of his reign and the dignity of his throne to the single satisfaction of ruining the woman he had never wanted and could not shake off. Across the Channel, Caroline made her decision, and it was the boldest of her life. She had been offered, in effect, a bargain, a handsome income, a sum spoken of as £50,000 a year, to stay abroad, keep away from England, and renounce the title of Queen. She refused it. She was Queen of England, and she would come home and be treated as one. Around her had gathered a company of shrewd and interested men who saw in her cause a weapon against a detested king and a detested government, the radical London alderman Matthew Wood, who would ride at her side in triumph, and the formidable lawyer Henry Brougham, who took up her defense and understood, better than the king ever did, the political thunder that a wronged queen could call down. In June 1820 she crossed to England and landed at Dover, and the guns of the castle, by some confusion, saluted her as she came ashore. What met her on the road to London told the king, had he been able to hear it, everything he needed to know. The people came out for her in their thousands. They unhitched her horses and drew her carriage themselves. They lit bonfires and rang bells and chalked her name and her cause on every wall, until "God Save the Queen" had become, in the mouths of the London crowds, less a prayer than a threat aimed squarely at the king. Windows that did not show a light for Caroline were apt to be broken by those that did. It was not, for the most part, that they loved Caroline, whom few of them had ever seen and whose failings were no secret. It was that she had become the perfect vessel for a discontent that had been building through all the hungry, angry years of the peace. The vessel for everything the country felt about a bloated and selfish king, a repressive government, a Manchester field still fresh in memory, In taking Caroline's side, the nation found a way to take its own and to strike, through her, at the man in the palace who had come at last to the throne. He craved only to find that his subjects would rather cheer his wife. He had wanted to be king, and he was king. He had wanted to be rid of Caroline, and instead he had summoned her home to the loudest welcome any figure of the age had known. Barricaded in his apartments with his brandy and his laudanum and his green bags of bought evidence, growing daily more fretful and more certain of his injuries, George prepared to do the thing his ministers had begged him not to do, to put his own wife on trial before the House of Lords, and with her, though he could not see it, his own honor, his own history, and the last shreds of the nation's respect for the crown he wore. The Queen was in London. The evidence was gathered. The collision that had been 25 years in the making was about to arrive, and it would be played out not in the privacy where he had ruined so many others, but before the assembled peers of the realm and a watching, roaring, delighted people. When George III died at Windsor on the 29th of January, 1822, blind, deaf, and lost in madness, the son who had waited the better part of his life for the crown received it with almost no joy. George IV was 57 years old, corseted over a swollen and gout-ridden body, and disliked by his people with a steadiness that a generation of caricature had hardened into something close to contempt. Yet the crisis that opened his reign had nothing to do with his debts, or his failing health, or the ministers he had inherited. It concerned the woman he had married a quarter of a century before and had been trying to be rid of almost ever since. Caroline of Brunswick was abroad, drifting through Italy in the company of a former servant named Bartolomeo Pagani, and by the old law of the land she was now, whatever George wished, the Queen of England. The moment the bells tolled for his father, she let it be known that she was coming home to claim her place at her husband's side. For George, this was not an irritation but a terror. He had loathed Caroline from the hour he first met her. He had married her only to have Parliament clear his debts, abandoned her within weeks of the wedding, and spent the intervening years assembling the case that would let him cast her off for good. He now demanded, above every other thing, a divorce. But divorce lay almost beyond the reach even of a king, and this king was himself a byword for adultery, a man whose own conduct could not survive the scrutiny any divorce would invite. His ministers, appalled at the prospect, tried to buy the danger away. They offered Caroline an income of £50,000 a year if she would only remain on the continent and give up the title of Queen. She refused. On the 5th of June, 1820, she landed at Dover, and the guns of the castle, by whose order was never quite clear, fired a royal salute. What followed astonished everyone. Caroline came home not as a disgraced wife, but as a wronged one, and the nation took her to its heart with a fervor that had little to do with her and almost everything to do with him. These were bitter years, the hungry years after the Long War, scarcely 12 months after the killings at Peterloo, a time of radical anger, of government spies, of men imprisoned for their opinions. Into that mood walked a woman the king wanted destroyed, and she became almost overnight the living emblem of everyone who had ever been ground down by an arrogant and hypocritical power. Crowds lined the road from Dover and drew her carriage through the streets by hand. London filled with her portrait in every window. Men wore ribbons and cockades in her name. Loyal addresses and petitions bearing hundreds of thousands of signatures poured in from every trade and town. Even the soldiers sent to keep order were seen to waver and to cheer when they should have stood silent, until a battalion of the Guards mutinied over their conditions, and the government trembled for the loyalty of the very men who guarded it. George was beside himself, and he answered the challenge with the whole machinery of the state. If the courts would not grant him a divorce, Parliament would grant him something worse. His ministers laid before the House of Lords a bill of pains and penalties, a measure to strip Caroline of her title as queen and to dissolve her marriage on the ground of an adulterous connection with Pagani. It was not a trial in any ordinary sense. It was a trial in the shape of a law, an act of Parliament that first had to prove the thing it proposed to punish. And so, through the late summer and autumn of 1820, the House of Lords sat day after day as a court, while the most intimate rumors of the Queen's life abroad were read aloud into the record for the whole country to devour. The prosecution's case rested on a procession of foreign servants ferried over from Italy and lodged at public expense, who testified in detail to what they claimed to have seen. They described the sleeping arrangements at the villa on Lake Como, the shared carriages, a tent pitched on the deck of a ship during a Mediterranean voyage, beneath which the Queen and her courier were said to have slept. They traced Pagani's extraordinary rise from a hired courier to the Queen's Chamberlain, loaded with a foreign barony and honours she had contrived for him, and invited the peers to draw the obvious conclusion. But the prosecution's chief witness, an Italian servant named Theodore Majocchi, collapsed the moment Caroline's defenders went to work on him. Under the relentless cross-examination of her attorney, Henry Brougham, Majocchi met question after question with the same 3 words, "Non mi ricordo," I do not remember, until the phrase became a national joke, repeated in every tavern, printed on every broadsheet, the perfect emblem of a case built on bribed and convenient memory. Caroline's defense, led by Brougham and by his colleague Thomas Denman, did more than shred the witnesses. It kept the king himself on trial in the eyes of the public. Brougham let it be understood, with deliberate menace, that if the Crown pressed its case to the end, the defence would answer it in kind, that it might open the whole question of the king's own conduct, his own adulteries, his own marriage. It was a threat that reached, though it was never spoken aloud in full, all the way back to the secret of Maria Fitzherbert, to the Catholic wife George had married in defiance of the law, and to the throne he might forfeit altogether if that marriage were ever proved. The government understood the warning perfectly. The proceeding meant to destroy Caroline was threatening, week by week, to destroy the crown instead. None of this made Caroline innocent, and the truth of her is owed as plainly as the truth of him. She was coarse where the court was refined, reckless where it was guarded, and her intimacy with Pergami had been real and flagrant and by any sober reckoning unwise. She had raised a servant to be the master of her household and paraded him across Europe. She had given her enemies, with her own hands, most of the material they used against her, and her own advisers privately despaired of it. She was no wronged innocence. But the country had grasped a distinction the king never could, that whatever the queen's private failings, they were her own, while his were the abuse of a whole nation's institutions, and that a husband who had thrown her away on their wedding night had forfeited any standing to sit in judgment on her now. She herself was said to have caught the whole absurdity in a single remark, that she had indeed committed adultery once, and only once, with the husband of Mrs. Fitzherbert. For the whole of that autumn the affair consumed the nation as nothing had within living memory. The daily testimony was printed word for word and read aloud in taverns and workshops the length of the country. The shops sold Caroline mugs and medals and printed handkerchiefs, the fashionable world split into hostile parties, and dinner tables divided over the guilt or innocence of a queen. And through all of it the king himself was nowhere to be seen. He kept to Windsor and to Brighton, unable to show his face in his own capital, while the marriage he had contracted for money was tried clause by salacious clause in the upper chamber of his own parliament and at his own people's expense. His ministers, for their part, found themselves in a wretched position, defending, at real risk to the public peace, a cause they privately detested on behalf of a master most of them could barely stomach. For what Lord Liverpool's government truly feared was not Caroline at all. It was what stood behind her, the vast, sullen, half-organized discontent of a country in hard and hungry times, for which the wronged queen had become a convenient banner, and which the whole squalid proceeding threatened at any moment to kindle into something the wavering soldiers might not be relied upon to put down. The trial of the queen had become, without anyone quite intending it, a judgment upon the king, and upon a social order that had begun, quite suddenly, to feel a great deal less secure than it had a year before. As the autumn wore on, the case rotted from within. The witnesses were broken one by one, their evidence was shown to have been coached and bought, and the peers who had been so willing to serve the king began to recoil from the ruin the business was making of the monarchy itself. When at last the votes were counted, the government's majority had shrunk to 108 against 99 on the final reading, a margin so slender that, with the House of Commons and the whole country openly hostile, ministers knew the measure could never become law. On the 10th of November, 1820, the Prime Minister rose and abandoned it. The news broke over London like a released spring. The city blazed with illuminations for 3 nights, church bells rang, and the windows of those who had stood by the king were smashed by crowds who saw, correctly, a great public humiliation of the man on the throne. It was celebrated everywhere as the Queen's victory, and in a sense it was, but above all, it was George's defeat. He had flung the prestige of a new reign into the destruction of his wife, and had been beaten by his own lords, jeered by his own people, and exposed to the world as precisely what his enemies had always said he was, a bully and a hypocrite whose crown could command fear but no longer command respect. And still the obsession would not die. The law had refused him his divorce, the streets had refused him his revenge, but there remained one ceremony over which the king's word was final, one threshold where he alone would decide who might pass. He could not unmake Caroline as his wife nor as his queen. But he could, he resolved, make her absence a fact of stone and gold, witnessed by the whole assembled realm. Through the winter the plans were laid, the robes measured, the jewels hired, the orders drafted for the doors and for the men who would hold them shut. The trial had failed him. The coronation would not. The coronation of George IV was not conceived as a right of state. It was conceived as a vindication. Beaten in the House of Lords, jeered in the streets, forced to abandon the attempt to divorce his wife before the whole watching world, the king needed to be seen again as something other than a man losing a squalid quarrel with the woman he had married. He needed to be seen as sacred. And so he poured into a single July day a sum the age found scarcely believable, by the accounts that survive, something near £250,000, when his father's crowning 60 years before had cost a small fraction of it. More than 100,000 went on jewels and gold plate alone. Tens of thousands more on robes and uniforms and the banquet. There was cloth of gold and crimson velvet, a train so long it required a file of pages to bear it. A new crown blazing with diamonds hired for the occasion, because even now the money to buy them outright could not be found. It was to be the most magnificent coronation England had ever staged, and every extravagant inch of it was arranged to glorify one enormous, aging, painted man. The day itself, the 19th of July, 1821, reached back for its splendor into the deep past. The peers and officers of state were dressed in an elaborate Tudor and Elizabethan fancy that George had chosen down to the last detail. There was a great procession along a raised and carpeted walk from Westminster Hall to the Abbey, and there was the banquet in the hall afterward, the last such coronation banquet any English monarch would ever hold. Into that hall, in full armor and mounted on a horse, rode the king's champion, to fling down his gauntlet and challenge any man who dared deny the sovereign's right, a piece of medieval theatre performed for the last time in the nation's history on behalf of a king whose right no one disputed and whose person almost no one loved. Around him the abbey was packed with peers and their ladies in hired splendor, and with thousands of spectators who had paid dearly for their places, while beyond the walls the ordinary crowds were held at a distance by ranks of soldiers. The heat was tremendous, and the vast corseted figure at the center of the right, sweating beneath his robes and the weight of the new crown, was said more than once to seem near to collapse. And at the center of it all, lowered with difficulty into his place, painted against the ruin of his face, George reached the summit of a lifetime's waiting, and while he did, his wife was at the doors. Caroline had been warned to stay away. Her own advisers begged her not to go. The government had made plain she would not be admitted. To appear was to court exactly the humiliation that waited for her. But Caroline had learned across 25 years that defiance was the only weapon left to a woman whose husband held every other. She was still, in law, the Queen of England, and she meant to be crowned. On the morning of the coronation, she dressed, entered her carriage, and drove to Westminster to claim the place she believed was hers. What followed was as cruel as anything in the whole long war between them. She went first to Westminster Hall and was refused. She went to the Abbey, to the great west door, and was met by soldiers with crossed bayonets and by pages who demanded a ticket of admission she did not possess. The Queen of England asked at the door of her own coronation for a ticket and turned back because she had none. She moved along the building from entrance to a side door, to the door by Poets' Corner, and at each she was stopped by men acting on the king's explicit written command. A voice at one of the doors, it was said, called out that the queen could not come in, and the doors were shut in her face. Some in the crowd who had roared for her a year before now stood in an uneasy, shuffling silence. A few jeered. For those who watched, it was the final, brutal full stop of the marriage. The wife hammering to be let in, while the husband, hearing nothing of it, received his crown within. At last she gave it up, turned her carriage, and was driven away through streets that had, in the space of a single year, cooled toward her almost as completely as they had once blazed. Inside, George had his day of gold, undisturbed. It broke her, Whether the humiliation was cause or grim coincidence can never be settled. But from the coronation, Caroline's health failed with terrible speed. She had been unwell for some time. Now, within hours of being turned from the abbey, she was seized with a violent internal illness. She took to her bed at Brandenburg House, her home at Hammersmith, and there for 3 weeks she declined, while her physicians argued over an obstruction of the bowel and dosed her with remedies that most likely hastened what they meant to cure. She faced the end with a stubborn, unbroken clarity. She set her affairs in order, burned her papers, and gave directions for her burial. She was to be carried home to Brunswick, the country of her birth, and laid there beneath a plate that named her, in her own chosen and defiant words, the injured Queen of England. She died on the 7th of August, 1821, 3 weeks and a day after the locked door, aged 53, and in death she indicted him one last time. The government, dreading precisely what her funeral might become, ordered the cortege moved quietly out of London to the coast by a route that skirted the city. The crowds would not have it. They came out in their thousands, blocked the roads, tore up the pavement, and fought the soldiers to force the procession back through the heart of the capital, past the palaces, they insisted, that had shut her out. At Cumberland Gate, by Hyde Park, the lifeguards fired into the crowd, and 2 men fell dead. The Queen's coffin passed on toward Harwich through streets of grief and rage and took ship for Germany, and the country understood that it was burying more than a woman. It was following the King's own decency to the grave, the ordinary human forbearance he had thrown away in a lifetime spent breaking a wife who, whatever her faults, had nowhere left to go. The 2 men shot down at Cumberland Gate were buried as martyrs, their own funerals swelling into great processions of protest, and the coroner's juries returned verdicts that condemned the soldiers' fire. The government had wanted a quiet embarkation, and had presided instead over blood in the streets of the capital, spilled over the coffin of the Queen. It had failed to convict. Even in death, Caroline had cost the King another measure of the little goodwill his crown had left. The spectacle of her body fought over by the people and the guards was the last public act of a marriage that had been, from its first day to well beyond its last, a public catastrophe. George received the news in seclusion, and his response was that of a man who had mistaken relief for victory. He was free at last, free of the trial, free of the marriage, free of the loud, coarse, inconvenient presence that had shadowed him for a generation, and reflected his own hypocrisy back at him. But he had bought that freedom at a price he seems never to have counted. He had won the war against Caroline and lost the last of his people in the winning. The crown he had gilded at such expense now sat on a head the nation had ceased to honor, and no weight of cloth of gold could hide the fact. There is a cold symmetry in the ending of their marriage that ought to be stated plainly and without sentiment on either side. They were 2 ill-matched people, chained together for 26 years by nothing but money and the needs of the succession, and the fault between them was never all on one side. Caroline was no plaster saint. She was loud, indiscreet, unclean by the fastidious standards of the court she had entered, and reckless in ways that had handed her enemies their weapons. Her conduct abroad had been genuinely compromising, and her own friends knew it. But when everything is weighed, the heavier guilt is the King's, and it is not a close reckoning. He had chosen her sight unseen for her dowry, recoiled from her on their first meeting, deserted her within weeks, kept their only daughter from her, and then, when he might simply have let her live out her days quietly abroad, spent the power and the money of a kingdom to grind her into the earth. She had faults, and they were real. He had a nation's whole machinery, and he turned it upon one unprotected woman until she was dead. For the coronation had given George precisely what he asked of it, and nothing that he needed. He had his day of unmatched magnificence, and the prince and the paintings would preserve its glory for as long as the reign was remembered. But what the nation carried away from the summer of 1821 was not the gold. It was the image of a queen turned from door to door in the heat and dead within 3 weeks, while her husband feasted beneath his hired diamonds. He had staged the most splendid coronation in the history of the kingdom, and made of it, without ever intending to, the most damning. With Caroline in her Brunswick grave, the great public drama of George's life was over. There would be no more trials, no more processions of paid witnesses, no more battles fought across the newspapers over the secrets of his marriage bed. What remained was quieter and, in its way, worse. The king withdrew from the stage he had commanded for 40 years and turned inward, into brandy and laudanum, into the flattery of a shrinking circle, into the vast and echoing rooms of Windsor, where a man who had at last obtained everything he had ever wanted discovered that the wanting had been the only part of any of it that gave him pleasure. From here, the scandal would no longer lie in what he did to others. There were few others left for him to do it to. It would lie in what he had made of himself. By the middle of the 1820s, the first gentleman of Europe had, in every sense that mattered, disappeared. What remained at Windsor was not the prince who had dictated the taste of a generation, but a swollen and failing old man, sealed behind the castle walls, seen by almost no one, a sovereign who had become a rumor to his own subjects. The change was not merely a matter of creeping infirmity, though the physical ruin was severe enough. It was a retreat, a deliberate, near-total withdrawal from a country that had wearied of him, and from a reign he could no longer bear to conduct in the open. He had always needed to be looked at. Admiration had been the very element he breathed. But after the trial of the Queen and the disgust that trailed behind it, the looking had curdled into loathing, and the king could not endure it. So he shut himself away. For much of these last years, he did not even live in the great castle itself, which stood half dismantled under the scaffolding of its own rebuilding, but in a rambling, ornamented cottage in the great park nearby, the Royal Lodge, with the park closed around him and the public shut firmly out, tended by a small and well-rewarded circle at whose centre sat his last companion, Elizabeth, Lady Conyngham. She and her family grew steadily richer in his service, gathering jewels and offices and pensions, while the king they attended sank slowly out of the world. Within those guarded rooms he lived in a gilded fog. His body, punished by 60 years of appetite, was breaking down with a cruel thoroughness. He was so crippled by gout that he could barely stand, so swollen with dropsy that his legs had to be bandaged, so clouded by cataract that he could scarcely read, and so dependent upon laudanum, the tincture of opium he took for his pains and for his nerves, that he swallowed it in doses which astonished the physicians who prescribed it. He kept strange hours, sleeping through the daylight and waking into the drugged small hours, lying for long stretches in a curtained warmth, ringing for brandy, drifting between torpor and sudden animation. The most fashionable man of his age had become a shape beneath a coverlet, painted and perfumed against his own decay, his face a ruin of broken veins. For years together the public scarcely saw him at all. He drove out, when he drove out, in a closed carriage through a park emptied of onlookers by his own command. Rumours ran through London that he was already dead, or wholly mad, or hidden past all recovery, and no one was permitted near enough to contradict them. He had made himself, the most watched man in the kingdom, into a sovereign whom almost no one was allowed to see, governing in theory some 20 millions of people, and in practice unable to face the few dozen who might have glimpsed him crossing a room. And in that shuttered half-light, the king's mind began to build itself a kinder history. As the real record of his life closed in around him, the wife hounded into her grave, the friends discarded, the fortune spent, the people's contempt, George withdrew into a version of the past in which he had been not the ridiculed spendthrift, but a man of action and courage. It was in these last years that he perfected the strangest and most revealing of his fantasies, the settled conviction that he had fought, in his own person, at the Battle of Waterloo. The story was told by the few who still dined at his table, and it has survived as one of the saddest indictments of the man. The king, warm with brandy, would begin to describe the great battle, the smoke, the guns, the reeling squares, and then his own part in it, the cavalry charge he had led across the field with the enemy breaking before him. He told it with detail and conviction, a general recalling his finest hour. On other evenings it was a great ride down a murderous slope or a race famously won, victories he had never won reshaped into memory. And then, having reached the summit of the tale, he would turn for confirmation to the one man at the table who had actually commanded on that field, the Duke of Wellington. The Duke, it was reported, neither contradicted him nor agreed. Asked whether it had not been just so, he would answer only with a cold and perfect economy, "I have often heard your Majesty say so, and let the silence do the rest." It was as much mercy as truth would permit, a refusal to feed the delusion that also declined, in front of the servants, to shatter a king. There was a terrible pathos in it, and also a kind of logic. A man who had been, in his youth, the most brilliant and admired figure in Europe, and who had ended reviled, could not easily live inside the true account of how he had travelled from the one condition to the other. So he built himself another in which the applause had never stopped, in which he had been brave and beloved and vindicated, and he withdrew a little further into it with every passing month. The brandy softened the walls of the present, the laudanum blurred its hard edges, and the invented past grew brighter and more richly detailed as the real one closed around him like a fist. It would be easy to leave him there, a figure of pure pathos, and easier still to jeer, but that would falsify the ledger, because even in the ruin, the one real gift that ran through the whole squandered life never wholly failed him. The same restless, ungovernable eye for beauty that had built Carlton House and raised the impossible pleasure domes of Brighton was, in these very years, reshaping the face of royal England, and much of what it made has outlasted every cartoon ever drawn of him. He did not merely hide at Windsor, he remade it. He set the architect Geoffrey Wyatville to work upon the old castle and poured a fortune into the task, raising the round tower to the height that gives the building its famous romantic silhouette, turning a decayed medieval fortress into the storybook symbol of the monarchy the world still pictures today. Nor did it end at Windsor. In these same years, he had the architect John Nash pulling down the old Buckingham House and beginning to raise in its place the palace that would, long after his death, become the monarchy's chief London home, though the work ran so wildly beyond its estimates that it swelled into a public scandal in its own right, and the architect would in time be disgraced for it. He had already reshaped the West End itself, the great sweep of Regent Street, the green frame of Regent's Park, into the elegant Regency townscape that still carries his title in its name. He gave his father's magnificent library, tens of thousands of volumes gathered over a reign, to the nation, where it became a cornerstone of what is now the British Library. And when a celebrated private collection of paintings came onto the market, it was the king who pressed his government to buy it for the public, the purchase that became the founding core of the National Gallery. A man dissolving in opium and self-pity was, at the same time and with the same hands, assembling a legacy in stone and paint that the nation which despised him would keep and treasure and never quite bring itself to credit to him. That is the paradox that has to be held. The cost of it was a kingdom governed by inattention. While the king rearranged his castles and refought his imaginary battles, the country beyond the park walls was being torn and remade by forces he neither grasped nor noticed. The smoke of the new industries, the swelling towns, the rising and increasingly furious demand for reform of a political order, the monarchy sat atop like an ornament. The machinery of state ran on without him, carried by ministers who found their sovereign an obstacle whenever they could reach him at all, and who learned to work around a king who would keep them waiting for hours while he dressed or dozed or wept, or simply could not be brought to attend to business. State papers piled up unread, decisions of consequence waited on the king's moods and the king's health, and the men who actually governed learned to treat their sovereign less as the head of the state than as a difficult and expensive formality to be managed. The throne he had craved for the whole of his life had become, in his hands, a thing he could no longer be troubled to occupy. The one great question of his last years that he could not evade showed him at his most helpless. For decades, George had set his face against Catholic emancipation, the relief of his Catholic subjects from the laws that barred them from Parliament and public office, clinging to it as a point of conscience and of his coronation oath. But in 1829, his own ministers, the Duke of Wellington and Robert Peel, judged the reform unavoidable and forced it upon him, Wellington threatening to resign and leave him without a government if he would not yield. The king wept and raged and talked of abdication, and at the last gave his assent to the very measure he had spent a lifetime resisting, beaten in his own closet, exactly as he had been beaten over Caroline. There was a bitter symmetry in it that he can hardly have missed. The man who had secretly and illegally married a Catholic in his youth and denied her, now signing, in defeat and in tears, the emancipation of her faith. He had become, by the end, a man of sealed compartments. He kept his pleasures apart from his pains, his monstrous debts apart from any thought of duty, his golden invented past apart from the bleak and shrinking present. He had spent a whole life curating an image the world was meant to adore, and the curating had cost him every real thing. The friends used and dropped, the women taken up and cast aside, the wife destroyed, the daughter neglected and then lost. Lady Conyngham stayed, and the paid attendants stayed, but the affection that is freely given and freely returned had long since been spent, and there was no one left from whom to buy it. By the first months of 1830, the question was no longer whether the end was near, but how near, and the country, with a terrible frankness, was waiting for it too. What was coming was not grief, it was the verdict. The end came slowly and in pain. Through the first half of 1830, the king lay at Windsor, 67 years old and worn out by a life that had held the excess of several, unable to walk, laboring for every breath, his body swollen and failing, his mind adrift on laudanum and brandy. He could no longer lie flat for fear of suffocation, and passed his nights propped upright in a chair, dozing and waking, tended by physicians who understood that there was nothing left for them to do. The man who had once been the mirror of European fashion, who had made the very word Regency a byword for elegance and raised the dream palace at Brighton, was a wheezing invalid governing an empire by the sheer inertia of habit, while in his own imagination he still, from time to time, led his phantom charge across the field of Waterloo. He died in the early hours of the 26th of June, 1830. A blood vessel had burst within him, the great labouring heart gave out, and at the very last it was quick. There was no wave of national grief, no sense that a golden age had closed. What there was, and what the age set down with an honesty that still has the power to shock, was relief. And when they carried him to his grave at Windsor on the 15th of July, the most powerful newspaper in the world delivered a verdict that has clung to his name ever since. There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king, wrote the Times. If he ever had a friend, a devoted friend in any rank of life, we protest that the name of him or her never reached us. It was not the spite of a single hostile editor. It was very nearly the plain truth, and every reader who came to it knew as much, for the people who had lived through his reign carried their own reckoning, and it was long. They remembered the coronation and its locked doors, and the Queen of England turned away in the street and dead within the month. They remembered the trial, and the paid witnesses, and the crown dragged through the filth of its own contriving. They remembered the years of the Great War, when the country bled and starved and hungered while the regent built and dined and dressed. They remembered the friends of 30 years dropped the instant they grew inconvenient, the secret wife denied to Parliament's very face, the daughter neglected in her short life and mourned too late in her death. The Duke of Wellington, who had served him and studied him as closely as any man alive, is reported to have summed him up without mercy: a bad king, a bad husband, a bad friend, while allowing, because it was true, that he was also remarkably clever. The obituary in the Times was only a nation's edition of the same judgment. The funeral itself at Windsor on that July night did nothing to soften the verdict. If anything, it underlined it. St. George's Chapel was filled with the great officers of a kingdom performing a duty rather than feeling a grief. The mourning was formal and thin and, by more than one account, conducted with little decorum, the assembled dignitaries talking through the service, and the king's own brother and successor, now William IV, behaving with a restless levity that struck those who noticed it as something close to indecent. They were burying the head of their royal house, and they could barely trouble themselves to look solemn. A more eloquent comment upon a reign could scarcely have been arranged. And yet to file George IV away as a monster, or to laugh him off as a mere buffoon, is to miss the harder and more uncomfortable truth of him, which is that both accounts are partial and both are partly right. Strip away the caricature of Prinny, and there remains a man of real and unusual gifts. He had genuine charm, quick wit, a cultivated and retentive mind, and above all an eye, perhaps the finest ever to belong to a British sovereign. The debt the nation owes that eye is enormous and largely unpaid. To George IV belongs the delirious beauty of the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, the romantic silhouette of Windsor Castle as the whole world now pictures it, the beginnings of Buckingham Palace, the gift of the Royal Library that helped to seed the British Library, the founding purchase of the National Gallery, the sweep of Regent Street and Regent's Park, and the whole confident, elegant manner, in building, in furniture, in dress, to which his name as regent is still fixed. Few monarchs have left so deep a mark upon the physical and cultural face of their country, but the gifts were shadowed at every turn by their opposite, and this is precisely the balance the comic legend exists to spare us. For every capacity he had for beauty, he had an equal and answering capacity for cruelty and for waste. His selfishness was not the harmless greed of a child, it was a steady, lifelong force that fell upon everyone within his reach and left real wreckage behind it. He was a bigamist who married in secret and then let his closest friend deny the marriage on the floor of the Commons to protect his allowance. He was a husband who spent the power and the money of a kingdom to break a wife he had abandoned on their wedding night. He was a father whose only child grew up a pawn between her parents and died at 21, more loved by strangers than she had ever been by him. He was a patron and a spendthrift on a scale that scandalized a country at war, and an addict who ended his days in a fog of opium and self-invented glory. The charm was real, so were the victims. The Times had touched, perhaps without fully knowing it, upon the truest thing about him. He had been offered, across his long life, more friendship than most men ever are, clever men, devoted women, loyal servants, a wife who had once genuinely loved him, and he had kept not one of them. There was Fox, who had lied for him on the floor of the Commons and been repaid, in the end, with coldness. The Whigs who had waited the better part of their lives for the offices he withheld the moment he had the power to grant them. Brummel, the companion of his glory, cut and abandoned to die abroad in poverty, and Maria Fitzherbert, the wife of his conscience, recalled and discarded until at last she gave him up for good. He had spent devotion exactly as he spent money, freely, carelessly, and without return, until the account stood empty. That a newspaper could write over his coffin that it had never once heard the name of a single friend was not the flourish of an editor. It was very nearly a plain report of the facts. His whole life, seen from its close, has the shape of a vast squandering. He was born to the highest place on earth, with the intelligence to have filled it and the charm to have made it beloved, and he spent those gifts upon his own appetite until nothing was left of them but the appetite itself. To the very end, he cast himself as the victim of his circumstances, of a tyrannical father, of grasping ministers, of an impossible wife, of the debts that were the direct issue of his own hands, never quite able to see that the ruin of which he complained was, in almost every particular, his own work. The fat and painted rake of the cartoons was, in a strange way, the most honest thing about him, a mask so long and so carefully polished that beneath it, at the last, there was very little man left to find. Caroline of Brunswick had been in her grave nearly 9 years when he was carried to his, and it is fitting that they were not laid together. She lay where she had asked to lie, in Brunswick, the country of her birth, under the defiant title she had chosen for herself against him, the injured Queen of England. He lay at Windsor, among the kings, beneath the silence of a people who could not, when the moment came, find within themselves a single reason to weep. The marriage that had begun in loathing and become the public catastrophe of an age ended so, a continent apart, each with an epitaph, hers a rebuke and his an indictment, answering one another across the water. He had no legitimate child to follow him. The crown passed to his brother, and within 7 years to a young niece named Victoria, whose long and dutiful reign would seem to the age that watched it the very reverse of everything he had been. He died, too, upon the very threshold of an age that would have had no patience with him at all. Within 2 years, the first Reform Act would begin to remake the Parliament he had treated as an inconvenience. The industrial country he had scarcely troubled to notice was already the future, and the quiet, domestic, dutiful monarchy that his niece would come to embody stood as the exact rebuke of everything his own life had celebrated. He was the last king of the old, gilded, profligate style, and he was carried to his vault, fittingly enough, just as that style was passing out of the world. And so the story returns to where it began, to the great doors of the Abbey, and the woman locked out of the coronation of the man within. That single image holds the whole of him. The gold and the ceremony were real, and so was the taste that staged them, but so was the cruelty that barred the door, and so was the wife who died of it. He was neither the harmless fool of the legend nor a simple villain, but something rarer and sadder than either, a man of exceptional gifts and bottomless self-love, whose selfishness curdled, decade upon decade, into a lifetime of scandal with real victims waiting at the end of it. He had wanted, above all things, to be adored. He died, as the Times told the nation and the nation already knew, as nearly unloved as a man can arrange to be, having spent a lifetime and a fortune and the whole of a kingdom's patience making certain of it. The first gentleman of Europe, the man who had everything, and who, in the end, was exactly as alone as he had made himself.